Your lecturer is Angus Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is a professor of English and film at The Ohio State University and a core faculty member at Project Narrative. He holds a PhD in English from Yale University. Dr. Fletcher is the author of more than a dozen feature screenplays and television pilots. His academic research into story science has been funded by several organizations, including the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Professor Fletcher has received teaching awards from Yale and the University of Southern California, and he was listed as one of Hollywood's top educators by Variety magazine.
Screenplays are, of course, the lowest form of art. Academy Award nominee John Milius referred to them as hack work. And then he changed his mind and called them garbage. And one of Casablanca's screenwriters remarked of his Oscar-winning script, "There wasn't one moment of reality in it. We weren't making art. We were making a living." So why would you want to learn about screenwriting when even the best screenwriters have cast aspersion on it? Over the next 30 minutes, I'll try to answer this question by showing you the value of studying screenplays. My name is Angus Fletcher, and I'm a full professor at Ohio State's Project Narrative, the world's leading academic think tank for the study of stories and how they work. And I'm also a screenwriter and a story consultant on Hollywood studio films and TV. So I've studied scripts from inside and out, and I'll share what I've learned about both the theory and the practice of screenwriting. I got my PhD from Yale in literature, but before that, my academic training was in neuroscience, and my current research at Project Narrative is in story science, where we collaborate with psychologists to use brain imaging and behavioral studies to explore how stories work in the mind. Science might not seem a natural way to understand an art like screenwriting, and when I started using neural scanners to analyze the effects of movie scripts, I did have a recurring nightmare that it would destroy the more magical aspects of storytelling, dead-ending in a grim dystopia where our creative imaginations were replaced by robotic algorithms. But as I hope you'll see over this course, neuroscience won't narrow or constrict your artistic vision. Quite the opposite. It will open up endless new creative space by tearing down some pseudoscientific myths that have stunted the study of screenwriting. To start with, neuroscience debunks the idea that there's a universal formula for all great scripts, or that all scripts follow the eternal pattern of the hero's journey. And it also sweeps away the theory that there are only 6 or 7 or 8 kinds of plot, or that all characters are based in timeless cognitive archetypes. In place of these oversimplifications, the empirical methods of modern neuroscience reveal a vast library of storytelling techniques that unlock endless possibilities for screenwriting, allowing you to experiment and innovate so that you don't just repeat the same plots over and over like a mindless superhero sequel. You do what your favorite scripts do and expand what people think and feel. To throw open these new horizons, we'll begin our lecture today by exploring 3 ways that studying scripts can change your life. Only one of them involves packing your bags and moving to Hollywood. The first life-changing thing you can learn from studying scripts is how to grow your storytelling powers. Because if you want to learn more about stories and the incredible things they can do, there's no better place to start than screenplays. Story is the core of every screenplay. And that's why 25 centuries ago, back when screenplays were stage plays, the Athenian polymath Aristotle observed that the plot of any script could be summed up in a few crisp sentences. If you needed more than that, either it wasn't a good story or you weren't a good storyteller. The same general rule holds true today. If you pitch screenplays professionally, you're expected to distill your 100-page scripts down into log lines of 20 words or less. Here's an 18-word logline for the Oscar-winning 12 Years a Slave. The true story of a man kidnapped into slavery who fights for over a decade to get home. Here's a shorter logline for My Big Fat Greek Wedding. A woman attempts to get her fanatically Greek family to accept her not at all Greek fiancé. And here's an even shorter logline for Rocky. A small-time boxer gets a shot to be the champion of the world. These core plots are so powerful that you can already feel the action of the film without a single actor or camera shot. The story alone is enough to move you. That story power is how outside-the-box films like 12 Years a Slave get made. And it's also what convinces studio execs to let total unknowns, like the writers of Rocky and My Big Fat Greek Wedding, act in their own scripts, becoming movie stars. The importance of story to screenplays is why many novelists and playwrights study screenplays. And you don't need high literary ambitions to benefit from honing your storytelling with screenplays. Because every one of us uses stories all the time in our ordinary lives to do extraordinary things. We use stories to bond with friends and family and even total strangers in private conversations or public toasts, or when tucking future generations into bed at night. We use stories in business to motivate our colleagues or inspire our clients. We use stories in politics to chart new futures for our democracy. And we even use stories to plot and replot our own lives, rewriting where we'll go tomorrow. That's because stories are perhaps the most powerful form of human communication. They contain information in action, and so they go beyond informing your audience. They move your audience, transporting and transforming them, touching their hearts and changing their minds. So by studying screenplays and learning their tricks, you can move your own audience more powerfully and intentionally. And by unearthing the massive diversity of Hollywood storytelling, you can find the screenwriting tricks that click perfectly with your own personal voice. So you don't tell stories in some soulless, mass-produced style. You tell your stories, like you, only even more irresistible and enchanting. So that's the first reason to study scripts, to sharpen your own storytelling. And here's the second reason, to deepen your appreciation of films and TV. We've all watched a film or a TV show with our friends or family that they love more than we do. And usually, most of us chalk that up to differences of taste and move on. But by accepting that certain stories just aren't for us, we let whole realms of human experience slip past, like a traveler who walks past the great monuments of the earth, but never steps inside. And why do that? Why not seize the opportunity to enjoy the most powerful films and television shows ever made? Why not journey into the extraordinary places they create? By learning how screenplays work, you can journey into these other worlds. You can plug into the action of any movie, connecting viscerally with it, in your heart and in your mind, so that you don't just watch the screen. You feel it move you, unlocking a fresh experience, connecting you to a new community, and expanding your sense of the big possibilities of life. So that's two reasons to study screenplays: to become a better storyteller and to appreciate film and television more deeply. Which leads us into the third and most obvious reason for studying scripts. And that's because you want to create one. Maybe you can't help yourself, and you've already fallen in love with the idea of writing a screenplay. After all, even if the only art to be found in most scripts is the art of compromise, there's still something curiously seductive about them. So magical is the dream of movie writing that it's even bewitched a few of the greatest literary talents in history. F. Scott Fitzgerald moved out to Hollywood after he wrote The Great Gatsby, confessing that he wanted to get some real status as a movie man and not a novelist. Such is the siren call of Hollywood fame and fortune. And it's not just an empty vanity. We've all watched enough bad movies to wish that someone would write a few more good ones. And if not you, well then who? This course is designed to help you gain all three of these benefits from studying scripts, because all three of them start from the same place. Whether you want to become a better storyteller, or enjoy more films and TV, or write screenplays yourself, the key is to begin by breaking down scripts to see how they work. Okay, so how do scripts work? What's the secret to an effective story? Well, to grasp the real secret, we need to begin by letting go of the widely peddled cliché that there's a universal set of formulas for all great stories. I've been lucky enough to work with 2 different Academy Award-nominated directors, and both of them had fundamentally different ideas of what made a good story, and both of them were right. That's because story structure is not a pre-programmed, eternal piece of neural hardware. It's better understood as a flexible form of software that our brains use to map the world and imagine different pathways through it. And since the world is tremendously big and forever changing, and since the possibilities for human action are open-ended and always increasing, our brains are capable of deploying an endless number of story forms and structures. So think of your brain as a computer that can run all sorts of story scripts. And by downloading different scripts from other people and places, or by inventing original story scripts of your own, you can program your brain to think and act in new ways. Like Neo in The Matrix, you can turn on your TV and become a different kind of hero you never dreamt of before. Or like Charlie Kaufman in Adaptation, you can sit down at your screenwriting desk and create a whole new heroism of your own. Once we see that stories are an agile and adaptive form of neural software, we free ourselves to discover all the ways that storytelling has changed and diversified over time. When the ancient Greeks told stories, they preferred characters who expressed one simple emotion. Homer's Iliad is about the anger of Achilles and how this one feeling led to a cascade of world-changing mayhem. We can still appreciate a character like Achilles today. The end of the Oscar-winning Unforgiven is an Achilles killing spree of unhinged fury. But since roughly the age of Shakespeare, we've also learned to tell stories about characters who feel 2 things at the same time. Like Hamlet, when he says, to be or not to be. And so, where Achilles became a legend for his consistent rage, Hamlet became a legend for his inconsistency, his reversals, and his indecision. This divergence between Hamlet and Achilles is just one example of the richness of storytelling methods. The world is filled with diverse cultures and traditions, and each of our individual brains works a little bit differently too. So there's an almost limitless number of right ways to tell a story. This diversity is exciting and liberating. But it also poses a major practical challenge, because if there isn't one master narrative for every good story, then how do you learn how to become a more effective storyteller? If the options for story are endless, then how do you find the right choice for you? Here's the real secret. To discover your own most effective stories, you use a technique known as reverse engineering. That might sound terrifying, but I promise it's not. The term reverse engineering is a modern coinage mostly used now by programmers and engineers, but it refers to a rhetorical technique that's been used to analyze scripts for thousands of years. It goes all the way back again to Aristotle, 2.5 millennia ago. In the Poetics, Aristotle gathered up the most popular scripts of his time, the dramatic tragedies of Athens, and he decided to figure out the nuts and bolts of how they worked. To do that, he started by observing that tragedies had a pair of cognitive effects on audiences. And those 2 cognitive effects were pity and fear. Aristotle then traced these 2 neural outcomes back to a specific plot event, called an anagnorisis, where a character has a tragic epiphany. Like the moment where Oedipus suddenly realizes that he's fulfilled the ancient prophecy that he's tried to escape all his life. The prophecy that he'll kill his father and sleep with his mother. Aristotle's analysis of Oedipus is our most ancient example of the simple 2-step process of reverse engineering. First, you identify the script's cognitive effect. And just to be clear what we mean by a cognitive effect, it's anything that happens in the brain. So emotions, feelings, moods, attitudes, perceptions, and all of these are cognitive, even though we sometimes refer to them colloquially as taking place in the heart or the imagination. Second, once you've identified the script's cognitive effect, you trace it back to the particular story structure in the script that causes that effect. So Aristotle identified two cognitive effects, fear and pity, and he traced them back to specific features of the plot. So step 1, isolate the cognitive effect. Step 2, isolate the unique story structure that causes it. That's reverse engineering. So is Aristotle's reverse engineer correct? Well, even though he drew up his blueprint for tragedy thousands of years ago, it fits tightly with what we now think about the neuroscience of pity and fear today. Modern psychologists generally view fear as the most powerful and ancient emotion in the brain, rooted deep in the primeval regions of our amygdala. And nothing stimulates our amygdala more strongly than human suffering we can't understand. Because if we can't fathom the source of someone else's suffering, we can't make a plan to avoid it ourselves. And so we feel in a constant state of danger. That's why horror movies, as we'll explore in our lecture on Jaws, are rooted in sharks and psychopaths and other things that our minds can't quite predict. That's why tyrants maintain their power by being arbitrary. And in the case of Greek tragedy, that's why Oedipus's suffering is rooted in the inscrutable turnings of fate. The tragic power of fate often goes underappreciated in the modern world because when we discuss fate, we usually try to analyze it philosophically, leading our conversations about Oedipus to devolve into debates about free will versus determinism. We try to figure out who's to blame for this tragedy. Is Oedipus really at fault? Is it the gods who are responsible instead? Or are even the gods in the grip of some malfeasant power that makes puppets of us all? But when we attempt this rationalization of Oedipus's doom, we ruin the primal mystery that Greek audiences felt in fate. Because the whole point of fate to the Greeks was that its workings could not be logically understood by human brains. Fate lay above us, in the heavens, beyond our mortal realm of comprehension. This raw incomprehensibility of fate is what makes the story of Oedipus so incredibly terrifying. Because when the original Greek audience saw Oedipus crushed by a mysterious power that they couldn't fathom or predict, their amygdalas went crazy, just like Aristotle's blueprint for tragedy suggests. So the first part of Aristotle's reverse engineer seems to work. The plot of Oedipus is specifically constructed to cause fear because it bases the suffering of its main character in an inscrutable force. So what about the other part of Aristotle's reverse engineer? Does the plot of Oedipus also trigger pity? Well, pity is a cognitive strain of empathy. And as we'll explore in our later lecture on character, psychology studies suggest that we generally feel empathy for someone when we see their deep fears exposed. And this exposing of Oedipus's fear is exactly what happens in the plot event that Aristotle pinpoints as anagnorisis. Here, Oedipus suddenly realizes that the inhuman power of fate applies to him, upending his arrogant king act and awakening his old terror about the prophecy. And as we in the audience see Oedipus collapse in fear and in trembling, our brains do what neuroscience predicts, and they respond by pitying him. So yes, it seems like Aristotle was right about the pity too. Not bad for a guy who lived 25 centuries before brain scanners were invented. And that's why Aristotle's method of reverse engineering stories is still going strong today. It's used by theorists, like the story scientists at Project Narrative, and by practitioners, like the screenwriters in the story labs of Steve Jobs' Pixar. So whether you want to analyze stories or create them, Aristotle's ancient method is still very much on the cutting edge. From a screenwriter's perspective, the value of reverse engineering is that it allows you to recreate the brilliant effects of your favorite scripts without literally plagiarizing them. If you copy the superficial details of your favorite script, you'll end up with a cheap knockoff. But if you use reverse engineering to go beneath the script's surface, you can discover its deeper creative logic, coming to understand why the author made the choices that she did. And once you understand why the author made the choices that she did, you can then tweak and adapt and extend those choices, making new creative decisions of your own. That's how Shakespeare managed to distinguish himself as more than a cheap hack. Shakespeare's first comedy, The Comedy of Errors, was a direct rip of the Roman playwright Plautus. And his first tragedy, Titus Andronicus, was plundered from the Roman playwright Seneca. But while Shakespeare was copying these authors, he was also using a version of reverse engineering that he learned from his rhetoric schoolbooks to uncover the deeper story logics beneath Roman comedy and tragedy, enabling Shakespeare to later do things like craft the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, which combines humor and horror in ways that the Romans never imagined. Reverse engineering will allow you to develop your own original voice in the same way. First, it gives you the freedom to choose your own storytelling models. Since the premise of reverse engineering is that there are endless ways to write a good story, it affords you endless freedom to decide what kinds of scripts you want to pickpocket. And second, reverse engineering helps you glimpse the deeper intentions of the authors that you rob, allowing you to do what those authors did and make your own unique story choices and innovations. Until hopefully, someday, you become the next Shakespeare that other writers steal from. So that's the power of reverse engineering. It's a scientific approach that doesn't limit your imaginative freedom. Instead, by helping you unearth an endless variety of storytelling blueprints, it opens up unlimited space for your own new creations. To help you learn how to use reverse engineering yourself, we'll explore it in further depth in our next lecture. Then, in the following 4 lectures on story world, character, tone, and plot, we'll explore the 4 main components that stories are engineered from. You'll notice that theme isn't one of those 4 components. That's because theme is not a part of stories. The whole idea of understanding stories in terms of themes dates back to Plato's efforts to discredit literature by subordinating it to philosophy, which we don't want to do here. Theme is the ghost in the machine. You can always superimpose it on stories if you want, but it doesn't have anything to do with the actual nuts and bolts of their operation, so I won't ever mention theme again. In our opening lectures, many of our examples of story world, plot, character, and tone will come from Greek and Shakespearean plays, from novels by Jane Austen and Mark Twain and Toni Morrison, from epic poems like the Iliad, and even from the Bible. This emphasis on novels, poetry, and theater might seem a surprising way to start a course on film and TV writing, but it reflects the fact that film and TV scripts are literary works whose origins lie in the most powerful and enduring literature of the past. And if you want to learn the fundamentals, the best place to go is to the source. To connect the literature of the past to the screenplays of the future, our opening lectures will also touch on over 20 Oscar-winning scripts. And from here, our next 12 lectures will offer detailed breakdowns of a dozen of the most legendary film scripts in history, from Casablanca to Star Wars, Toy Story to Fargo. As we'll see, each of these critically and commercially successful films has a different effect on our minds. So each of their scripts is engineered differently. Once you learn their special story components, you can then use these creations in your own writing. And you can also tweak or splice their blueprints to invent original experiences of your own, so you do what they did and innovate. Because the goal of these 12 examples isn't to limit you to 12 different ways of writing scripts. The goal is to teach you the method of reverse engineering so that you can unlock dozens or hundreds or thousands more movie experiences on your own, allowing you to appreciate or to create any kind of film script you can imagine. From here, our next 5 lectures will shift the focus from film to television, exploring some of the most celebrated TV scripts in history. We'll cover sitcoms like I Love Lucy, MASH, The Simpsons, and Broad City. We'll cover soaps like Grey's Anatomy, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Mad Men. procedurals like Law & Order, House, and CSI, and dramas like Game of Thrones. As we'll see, TV writing is different in some crucial ways from writing for film. But once again, our method will not be to impose a universal formula for TV writing. It'll be to learn to use reverse engineering to open up an endless library of TV storytelling possibilities. We'll see how the most apparently formulaic TV shows, even procedurals like Law & Order and sitcoms like Seinfeld, are based on unique story engines, enabling you to build and enjoy endless story engines of your own. But before we get into all these scripts, let's end this lecture by talking about one practical thing you'll need to learn to start writing screenplays yourself. And that practical thing is formatting. The format of scripts can seem like a daunting technical exercise, but don't let it intimidate you. It's just a secret handshake for a club that went out of business years ago. Back in the days of the old studio system, there were a lot of hard and fast rules about formatting. The margins needed to be just so. 1 page of screenplay needed to translate exactly to 1 minute of screen time, and so on and so on. And that's because everyone at the studio spoke the same language. Every film was made by the same people, working on the same assembly line. But in the 1970s, that assembly line was broken apart. The talent agencies pulled the actors, the directors, and the writers out of studio contracts, and now story development, financing, and even production are increasingly done outside the studios. Occasionally, studios still develop, finance, produce, and distribute a movie from start to finish. But most of the time, they partner with outside producers and financiers. As a result, the rules for formatting have become looser. People aren't all trained by the same studio anymore. They come from different backgrounds, and they read for different things. Some read for budget, some read for story, some read for the characters, and so on. So don't worry too much about the Byzantine intricacies of formatting. Since your first script will almost certainly be read more for the story than for anything else, focus on communicating that story, not on getting your margins exact. But even so, there are a few basic rules that almost every script observes. And since I hope these lectures inspire you to start writing, let's touch briefly on those big rules. The first rule of formatting is to get yourself a screenwriting program. This will do most of the formatting automatically, saving you endless wasted time and effort. If you try to write a screenplay on a regular word processor, you'll be shortening your life. Don't do it. If you just want to throw away your time on Earth, take up free climbing or something more stimulating. There are free screenwriting programs you can download from Google Docs and Trelby. If you want the industry standard for screenwriting programs, it's Final Draft. Everybody uses it, and it's extremely intuitive. Now let's talk about writing a scene. Each scene begins with a slug line, and each slug line has 3 main parts. The first part of the slug line is EXT, for exterior, if the scene is outside, or INT, for interior, if it's inside, or sometimes EXT/INT if it shifts between the two. The second part of the slug line is the physical location, like Andy's bedroom, or Fargo, North Dakota. The final part of the slug line is the time mark, often day or night, to let the crew know whether they need to prep the set for noon or midnight. But the time mark can also be CONT, for continuous, if it follows immediately after the scene before. And it can also be moments later, or minutes later, or next day, if that's the best way to communicate the time at which it happens. After the slug line, there are 2 big types of script content. The first kind of content is scene descriptions, or action beats, like a row of moving boxes lie on the floor, or a car bursts through the curtain of snow. Action is always in the present tense, and you can use caps to highlight important beats or objects in the action or descriptions. A car bursts through the curtain of snow. Just don't overdo it with the caps. It's like shouting. People pay more attention when you do it selectively. The second type of script content is dialogue. If you're using Final Draft to enter dialogue, just hit Tab. The first dialogue component you'll enter is the character's name, in caps. Then hit a hard return and enter their words. If you want to insert an action in the dialogue, hit Tab after the character's name, and it'll give you a parenthesis. In general, don't explain what the camera does. That's the director's job. Your job is to describe the scene with enough visual flair that the director can see what the camera should see without you being explicit about it. We'll talk more about how to do that in our lecture on tone. To begin your script, you can write fade in, or cold open, or over black, if you want sounds or dialogue to come in first. Or you can just start without any of those directions, allowing the director to make the call. Because hey, directors always like to make the call. If you have more technical formatting questions, study a few of your favorite screenplays and crib from them. If you can't find an answer to your formatting question in these screenplays, the chances are it's not that big a deal. So just do whatever makes most sense to you. As long as you're not printing your script on scented paper or in multicolored ink, people will read the first page. And if they like the first page, they'll read the second page. Because really, people in the industry just want to know, do you have a good story to tell? A story that grabs them, a story that they haven't seen before. If you do, they can fix the formatting. If you'd like to practice formatting, here's a couple exercises you can try. First, get a copy of one of your favorite scripts. Then retype their opening scene in Final Draft or your own screenwriting program to get a feel for how the format works. Second, without consulting the official script and instead simply rewatching part of the final film on screen, type up another scene. Then compare it with the original script and see how the two compare. There's a lot about scripts and about storytelling to learn. And so sometimes in the following lectures, I might talk with a heightened velocity to get it all in. But I just want you to get all the big knowledge you need. For the remainder of these lectures, I'll be addressing you like you want to be a screenwriter, because the most effective way to learn to better appreciate films or to tell better stories is to think like a screenwriter. But in the final lecture, I'll circle back and talk specifically about how everything in this course can be applied to improve your film appreciation and your storytelling. So if you ever feel bogged down in the nitty-gritty of screenwriting and you want more on enjoying TV or honing your stories, skip ahead to the final lecture to put it all in perspective. Because, as always with reverse engineering, whenever things seem murky or mysterious, the way to find your answer is to turn to the end and work back from there. If you could go anywhere, where would it be? Because a script can take us all there right now. Throughout this course, we'll explore over a dozen different places that scripts can take our minds, from joy to the sublime, to suspense, to wonder, to longing, to charm, to nostalgia, to alienation, to existential meaning, to surreal connection, to big sympathy. And beyond these destinations, there are hundreds and thousands more. There are as many places for scripts to go as there are ways for different cultures and individuals to experience the world. Because scripts can tap into the full range of our cognitive capacities, whether emotional or intellectual, visceral or philosophical, inspirational or tragic, subtle or earth-shattering. So when you're planning a script, the first decision to make is, where do I want to take my audience's minds? What emotion or idea or new perspective do I want to leave them with? The more precise you can be when making this decision, the more precisely you'll succeed. Because in even the simplest cognitive effects, there's a huge range of options for you to choose from. Take happiness. It seems a simple feeling, but our brains can appreciate many, many different kinds of happiness, from quiet satisfaction, to deep relief, to ecstatic wonder. And happiness is just one feeling. There is a huge spectrum of other emotions and attitudes and experiences to choose from, all with their own varieties and local blends. To marshal this huge range of cognitive possibilities, you'll want to develop your own powers of discrimination in the same way that chefs develop their powers of taste. To be a successful chef, you need to be able to distinguish between subtly different kinds of flavor and then trace each one of them back to the special mix of ingredients that produced it. And the same goes for being a storyteller. You have to learn to distinguish between subtly different kinds of story and trace them back to their special ingredients so that you can then cook them up yourself. That's why the first step in becoming an expert storyteller is to learn to identify all the different cognitive effects of stories. We know intuitively that stories have these different effects. Not all mystery novels thrill us identically. Not all sitcoms make us laugh the same. But before we train ourselves to appreciate the deep variety of stories, we can make the mistake of chalking up those differences to quality. If we like a story more, then we think it must be intrinsically better. And it's certainly true that there can be bad literature, just like there can be bad cooking. But it's also true that literature can be good in potentially infinite ways. Take, for example, Shakespearean tragedy. Hamlet and King Lear and Antony and Cleopatra are all enormously powerful scripts, but they also all have very different cognitive effects. Hamlet creates a mood of intimacy that has comforted generations of mourners. But King Lear is so existentially bleak that it was banished from the 18th century stage for being too depressing. And Antony and Cleopatra is different again, dazzling us with a multifariousness of tone that is elusive as its Egyptian queen. Or take the scripts for Gandhi and The Last Emperor. They're both epic biopics that culminate with the tragic death of their lead characters. They both chronicle huge cultural revolutions in mid-20th century Asia, and they both won Oscars, just 5 years apart. But Gandhi creates a feeling of spiritual connection to a greater love, while The Last Emperor creates a melancholic sadness for the vanishing of an individual life. We can't say that one is better than the other, because they're each trying to do something different. So if we want to become more effective storytellers, the first step is to learn to differentiate between all the different cognitive effects that stories can create. And the second step is to trace these differences back to their own special forms of story structure, that unique recipe that makes them work. Many of these special story recipes can be located in the plot, so that's generally the best place to look first. But as we'll see in this course, many can also be traced back to other story components, like tone and character and story world. By repeating this two-step process of tracing cognitive effects back to story structures over and over, we can reverse engineer a huge catalog of blueprints for moving hearts and minds. And in fact, the catalog of blueprints is so huge that we can't begin to learn the whole thing in this course. But we can do something faster and more helpful. We can learn how to reverse engineer any script you like so that you can assemble your own library of blueprints, tailored to your personal aesthetic taste and social commitments, giving you a personal writing guide for your next script. To get you started on this personal guide, we'll use this lecture to go back to the dawn of script writing, where we'll reverse engineer 3 major storytelling innovations from Greek tragedy and comedy. To uncover each of them and demonstrate its ongoing power, we'll start by identifying the special cognitive effect of a script's ending. Then we'll reverse engineer the storytelling structure that creates this effect. And finally, we'll see how this storytelling structure was used by a later Oscar-winning film. This will give you a few useful storytelling innovations you can use in your own scripts. And more importantly, it'll help you practice the two-step method of reverse engineering so that you can uncover any other storytelling blueprints that you need. So now, let's lay the big foundation for our library of blueprints by turning as far back as the recorded history of scripts can take us, which is to say, back to ancient Athens. The Athenians can seem rather traditional today, but they were incredible, dynamic innovators. They founded democracy 2,000 years before we managed to pull it off again. They created a fantastically rich, multicultural society that was in conversation with Egypt and Africa, Persia and Asia, Italy and Europe. And of course, they also invented the first scripts. Without the Greek playwrights, there would be no Hollywood. And as we'll see in this lecture, their innovations continue to form the basis for a huge variety of scripts today. So the Greeks can teach us some enduring recipes for story. And no less crucially, they can show us how to be like them and innovate. So we don't just repeat the past, we create new futures too. The first thing we notice when we gather up all the surviving scripts from ancient Athens is that there's one major difference between the cognitive effects they cause. Some of the scripts make us smile, the others make us weep. The Greeks called the first kind comedy, and they called the second kind tragedy. And this distinction between comedy and tragedy is so old that it now seems obvious to us, but it's worth pausing over because it reveals a deep connection between stories and our brains. For evolutionary reasons, our brains recognize two primary kinds of experience: pain and pleasure. To keep us alive, our brains try to steer us away from bad things by jolting us with pain, and to help us thrive, they try to encourage us towards good things by rewarding us with pleasure. Our brains aren't always right, of course, about what's good and what's bad, nor do they always agree even with themselves, which is why we have guilty pleasures, which we feel both bad and good about. But the bigger point here is that our brains are primordially wired to separate the world into sources of pleasure and pain. And so it's revealing that the most ancient forms of scripts developed to carry us towards both of these destinations. After all, you might think that literature would evolve only to bring pleasure. But the ancients invented not just comedy, but tragedy too. And this is our earliest empirical evidence that there isn't one absolutely better kind of script, because it shows us that scripts have worked from the very beginning to touch the full capacity of human experience. They don't privilege good experiences over bad. They engage with all that our minds can do. So now that we've practiced a little cognitive discrimination, separating pain from pleasure, let's practice reverse engineering. What special story ingredients did the first scriptwriters use when they wanted audiences to smile? And what different recipe did they use to make audiences weep? Well, as we saw back in our introductory lecture, when the ancients wanted to write tragedies, they told stories about the crushing power of the heavens. Sometimes gods like Dionysus would literally impose themselves upon the characters on stage. Other times they would send down prophecies, or furies, or plagues. So that's the big story structure of ancient tragedies. The up above squashes the down below. Okay, now what did the first scriptwriters do differently to create pleasure? What's special about the structure of comedies? Well, since comedies elicit the opposite cognitive effect from tragedies, we'd expect them to flip the plot structure of tragedy. And in fact, that's what the earliest comic scripts do. Instead of imposing the heavens down on the earth, they imprint the earth up on the heavens. So, for example, the ancient comedy Frogs bestows a case of intestinal diarrhea upon immortal Dionysus. In other words, it inflicts a gross human condition onto a god. The same goes for other ancient comedies. In Lysistrata, a woman sparks a revolution by unfurling her own sacred oracle. In Birds, the hero soars up into the clouds to overthrow Almighty Zeus. These stories are inverted tragedies. Instead of crushing down human life, they let it burst heavenward, running rampant over the deities above, which is why these stories bring pleasure and not pain. So that in its broadest form is the method of reverse engineering. We take a body of scripts, we discriminate between their different cognitive effects, and we then trace those effects back to differences in their story structure. Of course, it's not that difficult to distinguish between comedies and tragedies. So now let's take reverse engineering a step further and discriminate out a few influential sub-varieties of comedy and tragedy, starting with tragedy because its historical record goes further back. The more you study the scripts of Greek tragedy, the more you'll discover that these scripts can have an enormous variety of psychological effects. It's not just that the three main Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, write differently from each other. It's that each of them writes differently from themselves. Just like Shakespeare, they didn't stick to writing the same kind of script over and over. They continually experimented, inventing new ways to move their audiences. So let's pull out one of their innovations by reverse engineering perhaps the most iconic of all Greek tragedies, Oedipus. To reverse engineer a script, we start by isolating its special cognitive effect, pinpointing the emotion or the mood or perspective or other psychological experience that it leaves us with. So let's begin by turning to the end of Oedipus and identifying its final cognitive effect, as precisely as we can. And helpfully, the chorus at the end of Oedipus tells us what we're supposed to feel, revealing that the story has been a reminder to always temper our joy, because at any moment, life can deliver unhappy shocks. So as explained by the chorus, the goal of the script's ending is to instill us with an emotional caution, making our minds less prone to a painful overconfidence. The next step in reverse engineering is to work back from this intended effect to the structure of the script, searching for the innovation in the plot, or the characters, or the tone, or some other story element that helps guide us into a new state of mind. So let's ask ourselves, how does Oedipus's script carry us into a more restrained emotional state? Well, one way the script creates this effect is with its ingenious plot twist. Now you might be asking yourself, what ingenious plot twist? Doesn't the ending of Oedipus involve the fulfillment of a famous prophecy? How could anyone possibly have been surprised? Ah well, you've just fallen for the twist. Because the original prophecy that you and everybody knows is that Oedipus will kill his father and sleep with his mother. But nothing in the prophecy prepares us for what happens in the script when Oedipus realizes that he's done these things, which is to grab his mother's brooches and plunge them, the script tells us, quote, straight into his eyeballs. What? Why? Where did that come from? Who stabs out his own eyes? This grisly detail doesn't exist in the ancient prophecy, and it also doesn't exist in the earlier Homeric story about Oedipus. Sophocles specifically decided to include it in his script. And although we can't go back and scan Sophocles' mind to find out why he made this story choice, we can say that this choice is a powerful way to generate the final cognitive effect that his script was aiming for. Because the result of the script's gruesome plot twist is to make us, the audience, experience the same sense of uncomprehending dismay that Oedipus feels when the prophecy comes true. Like Oedipus, we duped ourselves into thinking that we had it figured out. We lulled ourselves into believing that the ending of the script would be neatly predictable, happening just like it's written in the prophecy. And then the unexpected happens, and we bear witness to a man suddenly and horrifically mutilating himself, shocking us into realizing that we couldn't see the future after all, and encouraging us to measure our steps more carefully tomorrow. And so that's how reverse engineering works. We track back from a new cognitive effect to a structural innovation in a script, allowing us to reproduce that cognitive effect by later including the structural innovation in our own scripts, which is exactly what the Oscar-winning script for Ordinary People does with the innovation we just uncovered from Oedipus. So spoiler alert, I'm about to give away Ordinary People's final twist. Ordinary People is the story of a suburban mother and father and their two sons, their lives seen happy, until the family is emotionally shattered by the death of one of the sons. Devastated by the loss, the mother and father argue and spiral apart, and the surviving son attempts suicide. But then, with the help of a scruffily compassionate psychiatrist, the surviving son slowly learns to heal, and in the closing pages of the script, this son overcomes another tragic loss, encouraging a feeling of hope in the audience's hearts. And immediately after this moment of hope, the script cuts to the mother and the father on a golf course as the mother proposes that she and the father take a vacation. So the script makes us feel like the family is at last coming back together, when suddenly, in a dramatic closing twist, the script ends when the mother walks out on the family, leaving the father and the son to face an uncertain future together. So you can see how Ordinary People follows Oedipus in trying to prepare us for the unpredictable tragedies of life by setting us up for a jolting final twist. Although there's no divine prophecy in Ordinary People, the script makes us feel that we've glimpsed a happy ending of family reconciliation, only to confront us with an emotional plot shock that simulates the deep uncertainty of life, moving our hearts to steel themselves for the tragedies that lie ahead. So the local lesson here is that if you want to recreate the cognitive effect of Oedipus, you can borrow its story innovation and create a sense of overconfident hope in the closing moments of your script, only to shatter it abruptly with your final twist. And the larger lesson is that you can recreate the effect of any script you admire by reverse engineering back from the ending's cognitive effect to the unique story structure that produced it. If you like the cognitive effect that a play, or novel, or memoir, or film, or comic book, or any other literary narrative has upon you, isolate the part of the story that triggers that psychological result and then incorporate it into your next script. And voila, your script will generate the same cognitive effect. Now, before going into more detail about how to use reverse engineering, we should stop and acknowledge an empirical fact that I'm sure you've noticed in your own experience, which is that not every audience member responds identically to the same script. People are different and they pick up on different things. Some of that variation is internal. Our minds are not all the same. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty of that neural diversity, you can become a story scientist at Project Narrative, and you can start to chart all the standard deviations and probabilities and percentages. But if you just want to be a storyteller, you can take comfort in the fact that quite a lot of the variation in audience response is due to an external cause, which is context. That means you can make your story accessible to a broader variety of audiences by providing them with a better context for appreciating it. And screenwriters do that by establishing the rules of the story world, which we'll learn about in our next lecture. But since we're still here in this lecture, and since our goal is to practice reverse engineering, let's keep things simple for now and focus on the one audience you know best, which is you. So to get more comfortable with reverse engineering, just analyze your own cognitive responses to scripts, tracking them to the structural features of the script that stimulate you. To practice this technique again, let's reverse engineer another story innovation that Oscar-winning screenwriters have borrowed from Greek tragedy. This innovation comes from Euripides' script, The Bacchae. Unlike other scripts of its time, which either stimulated pleasure or pain, The Bacchae did both. It prompted a mixed feeling of pleasure and pain, of smiling and weeping together. It was half tragedy, but also half comedy, so the ancients gave it a half-and-half name, tragicomedy. What story innovation allowed Euripides to create this new cognitive effect? Well, to figure out, let's reverse engineer the ending. The Bacchae tells the story of how the divinely intoxicated worshippers of the god Dionysus tear a skeptical king into pieces with their bare hands. And one of the intoxicated worshippers who rips apart the king's body is his own mother. And in the final moments of the play, she appears on stage triumphantly holding his head. While on the other side of the stage, her father enters, holding the king's arms and legs, and weeping for the death of his grandson. So the same situation gives one character joy and another character misery. There's pain on one side of the stage, and there's pleasure on the other. And because we in the audience see both sides of the stage simultaneously, we experience pleasure and pain coming from a single story event, the death of the king. So immediately, you can see the structural innovation that allowed for tragicomedy. What Euripides did was build a plot that split the audience's perspective between two main characters. On one side was a traditional male of Thebes who saw the world as he always had. On the other was a female worshipper of Dionysus who saw everything the opposite. To her, violence was love, femininity was power, and human loss was divine redemption. This split paved the way for an ending where one character saw tragedy as tragedy, while the other character saw tragedy as comedy, and a new script writing technique was born. So if you want to create a tragicomic effect in your own scripts, imitate the structure of the Bacchae and create two main characters who experience the same thing oppositely, giving the audience two ways to see it too, which is exactly what happens in the script for Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Once again, spoiler alert. Eternal Sunshine introduces us to two ex-lovers, Joel and Clementine, who've had their memories of their relationship erased after things ended miserably. And then in the last beats of the script, Joel and Clementine meet again, rediscover their initial chemistry, and decide to re-embark on a romance that was filled with suffering that they can no longer remember. The script could have chosen to portray Joel and Clementine's decision as a tragic choice by emphasizing the inevitable future pain of their relationship. Or the script could have portrayed this decision as a comic choice by emphasizing the hope of a fresh beginning. But instead, stealing a page from Euripides, the script gives us tragicomedy by providing us with one character who feels the tragic side of the decision and one character who feels the comic side. So here are the script's last 4 lines.
I can't think of anything I don't like about you right now.
But you will. You'll think of things, and I'll get bored with you and feel trapped because that's what happens with me.
Okay.
Okay.
So to Joel, this moment is comic. To Clementine, it's tragic. And to the viewer, it's both at once. That's the local lesson in writing tragic comedy that we can learn from Euripides. And the bigger lesson we can learn is to keep our eyes out for innovations, the things that scripts do differently. These innovations break us free from the scientifically bankrupt belief in archetypal plot structures, and they open up the door to endless new story inventions and discoveries. The historical record shows us, again and again, that different cultures and individuals have found ways to enlarge what scripts can do. And that's why the number one thing you always want to do when you study a script is look for what it does differently. What's unique about the cognitive effect that it generates? What's original about its story structure? This allows you to keep learning from older scripts, and it gives you the mindset to follow the Greek Democrats and create new scripts on your own. Now let's practice reverse engineering one last time by exploring another example of an Oscar-winning innovation in ancient scriptwriting, this time from comedy. Around the time that Alexander the Great pacified Athens in 335 BCE, scriptwriters started penning comic plays whose happy endings had a very different cognitive effect from the original comedies crafted back in the days of Athenian democracy. The happy endings of the older comedies had triggered an almost manic sense of euphoria, while the happy endings of the newer comedies were more sedate, generating a feeling of satisfied contentment. So when we compare the newer comedies with the older comedies, what was the big innovation in their story structure? Well, as always, there are different subgroups and different strains of both the older and newer comedies. But speaking broadly, when we reverse engineer, we see that the big difference between the two kinds of comedy is the problem or the crisis that initiates the plot. In older comedies, of which our surviving examples are all written by Aristophanes, the plot begins with an apparently intractable, real-world problem like war or famine or civic corruption. These problems are so daunting that most sensible members of the audience have already despaired of solving them. And so the comedies involve a slightly lunatic main character, because only a lunatic would tackle a problem that everyone else has abandoned as unsolvable. The lunatic then sets off to solve this problem in a highly eccentric way, for example, by building a city in the clouds or by journeying into the underworld. And as the absurd solution grows more detailed and intricate, it gradually pushes aside the real world with its own zany laws of physics until anything seems possible, and the original problem is solved not literally, but imaginatively. So, for example, at the end of the script for Frogs, the hero rescues a dead playwright from hell. At the end of Lysistrata, the inveterate foes of Athens and Sparta join in a dance. At the end of Birds, a man sprouts wings and becomes king of the gods. Step by step by step, the plots of these scripts shatter our normal sense of logic, catapulting us into a place of fantasy where anything seems possible, making us believe that whatever we dream can be achieved, which is why these older comedies generate a cognitive effect of manic euphoria. In contrast, when we look at the structure of the newer comedies, the most popular of which were written by the playwright Menander, we see that their plots aren't initiated by an impossible problem. Instead, they're set in motion by a problem that the audience knows can be easily solved. For example, their scripts begin with a misunderstanding, or a rash promise, or some other instance of personal cluelessness, where an otherwise normal individual drags himself into an unnecessary mistake. We've all made these kinds of mistakes. We've promised things we shouldn't have. We've told harmless little lies that have got out of hand. We've misunderstood what people were asking for. We've volunteered to do jobs that turned out to be way bigger than we expected. And the thing to do in these cases is to admit that we made a mistake and move on. But sometimes we're too proud or too embarrassed to do that. So we keep going and going and going, compounding our error, making things worse, until finally the whole unnecessary problem becomes such a big headache that we throw up our hands, admit we messed up, and ask for forgiveness from everyone we've inconvenienced. And that, in a nutshell, is the plot of the newer Greek comedies. A minor mistake gets compounded out of vanity or shame until at last the person admits their error and everybody forgives them and there's a closing celebration. So you can see why this newer comic narrative has a very different cognitive effect from the older kind. This newer plot isn't about motivating audiences to believe that the impossible is possible. It's about encouraging people to stop mucking up their lives unnecessarily. And so the psychological experience of the newer comedy is a feeling of things getting back to the way they should be. Instead of being a delirious triumph, it's a humbling sense of relief. This new kind of comedy proved so popular that it has become the basis of most modern sitcoms and romantic comedies. For example, there's The 40-Year-Old Virgin. Here, the unnecessary problem is that the main character is too embarrassed to confess his total lack of sexual experience, and the more he won't admit it, the more ridiculous his difficulties become, until finally, at the end, he confesses, and the terrible problem of his virginity dissolves. And there are many, many other examples of celebrated modern comic plots based on unnecessary problems that disappear at the end, like The Sting and It Happened One Night. Now, you might think that this popular storytelling innovation meant the end of the earlier way of writing comedy. After all, that can happen with technological innovations. The new smartphone wipes out the old. But literary innovations operate more like biological species. It can be the case that earlier life forms go completely extinct, but often their descendants coexist with newer species. That's why our world is filled with sharks and horseshoe crabs and even dinosaurs. I know. They taught you in school that dinosaurs went extinct. Except they didn't. They're all around us. They're called birds. Ask a paleontologist. The same is true with older forms of comedy. It's continued to flourish, and you can still see the ancient comic plot of A Lunatic Quest in Monty Python's Holy Grail, in every episode of Rick and Morty, and in Pixar's Oscar-winning Up. Up begins with an impossible problem. What happens when your true love dies? And the script then proposes an equally impossible solution, attaching balloons to a house to make it fly. And just like the old comedies where men sprout wings and build castles in the air, the psychological effect of Up is to fill us with a sense of euphoria as dreams become true and the imagination blooms. The local lesson here is that comedy, like tragedy, comes in multiple forms. And the way to disentangle those forms is to discriminate between their different cognitive effects, and then work back to the structural innovations that generate them. And the bigger lesson here is that even the most classic forms of story allow for constant innovation. Over this lecture, we've seen Euripides innovate tragedy, and the Alexandrian Greeks innovate comedy. And both comedy and tragedy have continued to be innovated to the present day. And the result of this innovation is not to produce one increasingly perfect master script. It's to generate dozens and dozens of different kinds of story structures that each do their own special cognitive work. Because just as this planet has room for an enormous diversity of species, old and new, human society has room for an enormous diversity of scripts, past and future. By now, you're hopefully intrigued enough by the power of reverse engineering to want to apply it to your own favorite scripts, because that's the next step. Only you can decide where you want your stories to go. And to build the plots that can carry audiences to these destinations, the first step is to reverse engineer the scripts that have carried your mind to similar places. So use your powers of discrimination to isolate the story structures that your favorite scripts deploy to transport you to another state of mind. And be as fine-grained and wide-ranging as you can, giving yourself a variety of detailed blueprints to work from. To help you with this process of blueprint making, our later lectures will explore 18 different cognitive effects that films and television can have, from horror and heartbreak to romance and wonder. So at least one of these, and hopefully many more, should resonate with what you want to do in your scripts, helping you expand your personal collection of story blueprints until you've curated your own library, tailored to your individual writing style and commitments, so you can engage the minds of your own audience and take them anywhere you want to go. If you'd like to practice a little reverse engineering now, here's 2 exercises you can try. First, rewatch one of your favorite movie endings. How does it make you feel? What's unusual or special about its cognitive effect that makes it different from other films that are similar but not quite the same? Can you create your own original story ending that gives you that same distinct cognitive effect? Second, make a list of 2 or 3 of your favorite endings. What do they not have in common? What's special or unique about the way that they make you feel? Can you connect these differences to a difference in their plot or their story structure? In our last lecture, we began with the ending, mapping a few of the endless places that scripts can take our minds. And now that we've got a sense of where we can go, we'll spend the next few lectures discussing how to get there. We'll start in this lecture where most scripts start, with what we call the story world, or, when we want to save ourselves a couple of syllables, just the world. So, what's a story world? Well, in a superficial sense, the story world is the physical space where the story occurs. That's why many movies begin with an establishing shot of a city or a wild outback or some other geographical place. But the real world of a story is much deeper than this physical space. The real world of a story is the rules of this space, the rules that govern what kinds of action happen here. Is it a world that shares our laws of physics? Or is it a world where people can time travel, or animals can talk? Is it a world where eternal soulmates exist? Or is it a world where we must each define love in our own personal way? There are endless story worlds that scripts can create, but the one thing they all have in common is that their rules are established crisply and clearly at the beginning of the story. These rules provide the context for the audience to appreciate what follows. They tell the audience's brain, this is how things work in the story world you're entering. If you effectively establish context in the first few beats of your script, you can reach out to an audience of millions and even billions. Because human brains are very, very good at adapting to new contexts. They just need a little help to orient themselves. To figure out how to help your audience orient, think of the rules of a story world as the rules of a game. So for starters, you want to keep the rules simple. This allows audiences to jump right in. Think, for example, of tic-tac-toe. The rules are so simple they only take a few moments to learn, and then you're off and running. But there's more to a good game than just simple rules, and that's why nobody really likes tic-tac-toe. As the characters in the script for War Games remark, tic-tac-toe is boring. It's always a tie. The game is pointless. So we need to balance the simplicity of our rules with some open-endedness. The action has to be able to surprise. But crucially, this does not mean that we can create the rules as we go along. When you're playing a board game with someone and they just make up a new rule, it feels instantly exasperating, and it's the same with stories too. So the way to make a more exciting story world isn't to keep tacking on more rules as you go. Instead, the key is to lay out a few simple rules at the very beginning that are easy to learn but offer endless opportunities to make fresh and unexpected moves. Like, for example, the rules of the ancient Sino-Japanese game of Go. Go has barely any more rules than tic-tac-toe. You can learn all the basics in a minute or two. But these simple rules create enormous creative possibilities. Go has more possibilities than checkers, or chess, or atoms in the cosmos. You want the story worlds of your script to be like Go. You want them to lay out a few simple rules that allow for complex, unpredictable outcomes so that your audience never feels trapped or bored. If you introduce the rules of your world in the opening few pages of your script, audiences will always accept them. They'll accept that superheroes can die, that cartoons can come alive, that pigs can fly. No matter how incredible these rules are, audiences are cognitively primed to accept them if they happen right up front in the opening beats. And no matter how extraordinary the consequences of these rules, everything in your script will feel authentic as long as you stick to them. Think about the end of The Matrix, where Neo causes bullets to drop from mid-air. This is a stunningly unprecedented moment. But we believe it utterly because the script's opening has established the story world is a computer program where even gravity can be reprogrammed. Or think about the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones rides on a submarine towards a secret island where the Nazis have the biblical chest containing the remnants of the Ten Commandments. This ending is nuts. There are straight-to-video B-movies with more plausible final scenes. And yet, our hearts race in genuine suspense for Indy's situation, because in the opening moments of the script, we've seen that he inhabits a world where brilliant supervillains meddle with archaeological treasures in exotic locales. Or think about the end of Out of Africa, where Karen Blixen endures terrible heartbreak to become a writer who communicates deep wonder to her readers. This is the most improbable ending of all. Nothing is less likely than becoming a happy and well-adjusted writer. Yet we believe this moment completely because the script has begun by establishing a story world where the human imagination can create romance in the face of blind cynicism and despair. And you too can make your audience believe in any ending, as long as you begin by introducing them to the rules of a story world where that ending is possible. The final fantasy will come to seem viscerally, palpably, emotionally true if it follows step by step from where the story started. So after you've decided where you want to take your audience's minds and you're sitting down to write a script, your first step is to identify the key rules that you need for your ending to happen. And your second step is to craft an opening scene that illustrates those rules dramatically, showing, not telling, so the audience can internalize the rules quickly and get lost in the action. Now, this might seem an overwhelming challenge. Not only do you have to imagine a whole new world where unprecedented endings can happen, but you have to boil it down to a few simple rules that the audience can pick up in a minute or two. How is that possible? Well, what makes it easier is that you don't have to create your story worlds from scratch. You can borrow the rules of an existing story genre that lays down the basic rules for superheroes and secret agents and fairy tale princesses and all sorts of other exotic life forms. So if you want a story world where characters fly, or thwart enemy spies with space-age gadgets, or go on unicorn quests to find true love, you don't have to explain any of that to your audience. You simply have to begin your script by signaling that it's part of a pre-existing story genre, allowing you to import the big rules of that story world into your own. Then you just illustrate the one way in which your story world is different. What can happen to your superheroes, or your secret agents, or your fairy tale princesses that can't happen in earlier story worlds? Or what can't happen in your story world that can happen in all the others? So your two-part method for establishing a story world is, 1, to signal your place in a pre-existing genre, and 2, to add or subtract or in some other way change a rule of that genre. This gives your story world both richness and distinctness. The richness comes from all the rules you borrow, and the distinctness comes from your one unique rule, which opens up a new vista of challenges and opportunities for your characters, preparing for your special ending. There's an endless variety of pre-existing story worlds that you can piggyback on, from gangster paradises to forensic crime labs to modern dating scenes to sci-fi galaxies to cowboy outbacks to enchanted kingdoms to surrealist postmodern landscapes. We'll break down examples of all these kinds of story world and many others that are popular in modern scripts in our 12 lectures on films from Casablanca to Fargo. But to prepare us for these different genres and subgenres and hybrid genres and anti-genres, we'll use the rest of this lecture to track the beginning of the 3 most influential script genres in history: the tragic, the comic, and the heroic. This big 3 provides the deep foundation for the story worlds of most film scripts today. So by tracing how each of the big 3 was established and innovated, starting with the ancients and moving into a half-dozen Oscar-winning scripts, we'll learn how to write the rules for any story world you'll ever want to create. To get started, let's turn to the oldest of the big 3, tragedy. The most ancient complete tragedy we have is Aeschylus's Oresteia. And although we can't say exactly what the story world of tragedy looked like before the Oresteia, we know that it emphasized the power of the gods over the mortals beneath. So the script for the Oresteia adopts this basic genre rule by beginning with a night watchman who looks up at the almighty heavens and bemoans his helpless lot below. Then the script adds its own special twist to the existing rules of tragedy by revealing the particular form of the watchman's earthly helplessness. He's stuck on a castle roof waiting for a signal. And as the script goes on to reveal, that signal will be conveyed by a row of signal stations that stretch from Troy to Greece, so that boom, 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 a chain of signal lights will reach across the known world, telling that watchman what to do. The simple, dramatic action of the signal lights immediately signals that the new rule of this story world is that no action is arbitrary. It's part of a chain reaction where the actions of the past return in the present and echo into the future, just like those signal lights repeat, boom, boom, boom. And this chain reaction is in fact exactly what happens in the script. First, a king murders his daughter to get good sailing winds for Troy. Then the king returns from Troy and is murdered by his wife, who is then in turn killed by her avenging son. So, boom, boom, boom. One family killing begets another. And there we see our two-step method for establishing a story world. First, the Oresteia aligns itself with an established genre or subgenre, in this case, tragedy. Second, it creates its own new rule, in this case, the boom, boom, boom. You'll notice that in the Oresteia, the new rule of the story world isn't introduced by telling the audience directly. It's dramatized through a simple action of leaping lights that our minds can pick up unconsciously. And that's because it's more effective to introduce a new rule by showing, not telling. So rather than starting your sci-fi script with a long exposition about anti-gravity boots, just show someone put on the boots and fly. The brains of your audience are used to subconsciously orienting when they enter a space, so they'll deduce the underlying rules of your new story world just by watching how things work in the opening beats. After Aeschylus innovated tragedy with his leaping signal lights, subsequent Greek scriptwriters used the same two-step method to create their own new directions for tragedy. And 2,000 years later, this same two-step method was used by Shakespeare to radically innovate tragedy again. Shakespeare's script for Hamlet begins just like the Oresteia with watchmen on a castle roof. And just like in the Oresteia, the past immediately returns, this time in the form of the ghost of Hamlet's father. So with these opening details, Hamlet crisply aligns itself with the story world of Greek tragedy, importing the now established genre rule of chain reactions, where the past re-echoes in the present. But then, after importing the old rule of Greek tragedy, Shakespeare adds his own new innovation. The script for Hamlet begins when a watchman shouts, "Who's there?" only to then promptly ignore the personal answer he receives, instead insisting that the answer be the standard response from the military handbook. Then Hamlet's friend Horatio shows up and refuses to believe that the watchmen have seen a ghost because ghosts don't exist in his scholarly textbooks. Then the ghost appears, and instead of listening to it, the watchmen attack it with swords. And then, after the ghost leaves, Horatio continues to insist that the supernatural visitation wasn't really a big deal because he's read about much worse things in history books. With these opening beats, the script shows the audience that its story world is one where the question, "Who's there?" is just an empty performance. No one in this story world is genuinely curious about the who or what of other minds. Instead, Horatio and the watchmen all just repeat the habituated actions and ideas they've memorized in the past. This adds a new twist to the ancient tragic rule of the boom, boom, boom of the past echoing into the present, because now the echoed things are standard military responses and textbook answers and other rote conventions, which reveals that the new tragic power that catches us up and grinds out our lives is the modern machine culture that we ourselves have built, the automated human rituals and sayings that we repeat mindlessly, like actors on a stage regurgitating the same lines night after night, not really listening to each other, but sleepwalking through life while we consign each other's special perspective to the void. So that's how Shakespeare innovates the old story world of tragedy. He takes the old rule of the boom, boom, boom of divine fate and transforms it into the new rule of the boom, boom, boom of modern convention. By creating the social formalities of civilization, the people of Hamlet's story world have pre-programmed their own behaviors as surely as any oracular prophecy, killing their spontaneous freedom and curiosity with a wheel of mass-produced conformism. This predestination of humanity's own construction is what Hamlet will fight against, erasing from his mind all saws of books, all forms, all pressures past, so he can completely hear the ghost's special instructions and express his own original feelings in uniquely poetic soliloquies. But no one can resist the rules of tragedy, and so the more Hamlet tries to break the mold, the more his life ironically becomes a series of cliches from other plays he's heard before, until finally the prince, who bears the same recycled name as his father, dies just like every tragic hero before him. And Horatio completes the obliteration by summing up Hamlet's life as a formulaic plot of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, of deaths put on by cunning and forced cause. And with that, Hamlet's rogue individuality is swallowed by the tragic story world of hackneyed stage conventions. So in Shakespeare, we again see the effectiveness of the two-step method for establishing world. First, import the rules of a pre-existing story world from a known genre. Second, add a new rule to these pre-existing rules by showing, not telling, using minor characters like the Watchman to illustrate that the new boom, boom, boom is the rote automation of modern culture. The enormous effectiveness of this two-step method has led to its use by every single Oscar-winning tragic script that Hollywood has ever produced. Take perhaps the most legendary tragedy in Hollywood history, the script for Citizen Kane. The opening scene of Kane introduces a, quote, great castle, just like the great castles walked by the opening watchman of the Oresteia in Hamlet. And just like the Oresteia, the story world of Kane re-echoes the crimes of the past in the present, as the willingness of Kane Sr. to trade family for money repeats itself in his son's tragic destruction of his own relationships. Boom, boom, boom. And just like Hamlet, the story world of Kane is one of mass-produced human cliches, as tabloid newspapers mindlessly churn out headlines, oblivious to the special inner things that, to quote the script, make us tick. But then the opening of Kane adds its own twist to this pre-existing story world by revealing that Kane's castle differs in one crucial respect from the castles of previous tragic scripts. Kane's castle has not been handed down from prince to prince, from generation to generation. Instead, Kane's castle has been built from scratch in a single generation by one man. So by beginning on this man-made Xanadu, the script for Kane reveals that the new rule of its story world will be that individuals can achieve an enormous power that carries them beyond being Greek kings into becoming Greek gods, achieving spectacular, self-wrought forms of destruction as their wealth unlocks their most personal desires, which return, ironically, to demolish them. So that's how Kane uses our two-part method to establish its own special story world. Simply by starting on that man-made castle, it imports the old rules of tragedy while establishing its own new rule, creating a world in which a new tragic story is possible. And as proof of the enormous fruitfulness and flexibility of this two-step method, another legendary Hollywood script, All About Eve, used it a decade later to innovate tragedy again. All About Eve chronicles the demise of a Hollywood starlet whose glamorous but empty life is slowly stolen by a younger doppelganger, until finally in the script's darkly ironic conclusion, the cycle starts up again when the newly famous doppelganger acquires a young doppelganger of her own. So how does the opening of All About Eve establish a story world where this new tragic ending can occur? Well, the script begins at a Hollywood ceremony for an annual Distinguished Achievement Award. And with this opening, the script aligns itself with the old tragic rule of a repeating boom, 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 as the past re-echoes in the present. Because every year, this Hollywood award repeats itself, round and round and round. But just like the man-made castle of Kane, the beginning of All About Eve also adds its own new rule to the story world of tragedy. Because in Hollywood award ceremonies, the round and round of destruction isn't driven by Greek fate or Renaissance convention or Gilded Age newspaper wealth. Instead, the round and round of destruction is driven by human vanity. Our desire to be celebrated, to be glorified, to be famous is what leads us to seek out awards. And this same desire is also what attracts the flatterers and doppelgangers and other Hollywood creatures who destroy our lives. So that the hunger for fame that makes us triumphant today becomes our undoing tomorrow, as a new starlet steps over our body to claim her award the following year. Boom, boom, boom. So there, again, you see the power of our two-step method for establishing world. Import the big rules of a pre-existing genre of scripts, then show, don't tell your new rule. Your new rule can be an addition, but it can also be a subtraction or a modification or any other kind of change to the earlier rules. The important thing is simply that it's a change. You can even flip an old rule if you want. One brilliant example of a script that flips an earlier rule of tragedy is No Country for Old Men. No Country begins with the hero remembering his father, a sheriff just like him, immediately conjuring up previous tragic story worlds like Hamlet, where the ghost of a father haunts the first-person psyche of a son. But then, No Country for Old Men innovates by having the son grimly intone that he's witnessed crimes unlike any his father knew. Quote, "You can say it's my job to fight it, but I don't know what it is anymore. More than that, I don't want to know. A man would have to put his soul at hazard." By claiming that the crimes of today are a new kind of moral hazard, No Country for Old Men elegantly inverts the core rule of Hamlet's. This new story won't be about a new individual in the same old tragic world. This time, the individual will be the same old, and the tragic world will be the new. So where the rule of earlier tragedies was the return of a past calamity, the new rule of No Country for Old Men will be the unprecedented horror of the present, the apocalyptic now, the fresh nightmare unknown to history. We'll get a chance to discuss more tragic scripts in our later lectures, but hopefully this brief tour has given you a sense of both the classic boom, boom, boom story world of tragedy and the endless opportunities to innovate it. And now, to see how our two-step method of world building works equally well for other genres, let's turn to a quick history of comedy and its story worlds. Comedy, like tragedy, comes in endless flavors and subgenres, the most popular of which has proven to be romantic comedy. Romantic comedy has existed since the 4th century BCE, and since its inception, its usual ending has been a wedding. To make that wedding seem a plausible and a happy ending, romantic comedies almost always begin by introducing the lovers as adult children, that is, as the explicit offspring of a previous marriage. This opening establishes the marriage as the deep rule that brought the lovers into being, and that will allow them to bring forth children of their own, creating a story world where love triumphs, generation after generation after generation. This rule of romantic comedy has been successfully repeated for thousands of years, inspiring writers from the ancient Greeks, to Shakespeare, to Oscar Wilde, to begin their scripts with adult children. But here and there, scriptwriters have found clever ways to tweak that opening rule, opening up new story worlds that allow for happy endings that depart from the old traditional wedding. So, for example, the script for Shakespeare in Love starts with a clever scene where a gang of men torture a theater owner with hot coals until the theater owner saves his skin by claiming to have a new comedy by William Shakespeare that promises mistaken identities, a shipwreck, a pirate king, a bit with a dog, and love triumphant. This opening beat establishes that the old comic rule of love triumphant still exists in the script's cynical story world of greed and violence. But it also establishes that the rule exists in a new form. Love triumphant isn't to be found in marriage. It's to be found in the words and performances of the stage. With this new rule, the script for Shakespeare in Love opens up a new story world where lovers can experience a consummation in art that can't exist in marriage, allowing for an ending where two characters who are married to other people nevertheless join hearts on the stage, so that by making one opening tweak to the rules, the script finds an original way for love to reign triumphant. And there you see how the same simple two-part method that's created so many tragic story worlds can be used to establish and innovate the story worlds of comedy as well. First, import the old comic rule of love triumphant from generations of earlier scripts. Then, show don't tell your new rule for how love can triumph, like the script for Forrest Gump famously does with its quirky opening rule that life is like a box of chocolates. Or, like the script for Jerry Maguire does when it suggests that the first step towards triumphant love can be a kind of divorce. Because after Jerry begins the script by divorcing himself from the culture of his agency, he then finds love by breaking up with his fiancée. Up to this point in our lecture, we've seen how our two-step method allows you to innovate any genre you want. But you can use this method to do more than that. You can also use it to bring whole new genres into being. The most spectacular historical example of this creative possibility is the third of our three big genres, the heroic. The heroic genre emerged after comedy and tragedy, and in fact emerged in opposition to them. In comedy and tragedy, the main characters are eventually forced by the action of the plot to conform to the big rules of their story world. But in heroic scripts, the opposite happens. The world doesn't change the main characters. The main characters change the world. Since we now live in an age that celebrates individual achievement, this can seem a fairly obvious storyline. Of course people can change the world. But this storyline didn't exist in antiquity. When the characters of Greek scripts resisted social norms, they were portrayed either as tragic figures like Antigone or as anti-heroes like Achilles. That is, they either lost their struggle with the story world, or if they won, they left things for the worse. The Renaissance inherited a similarly negative view of individual action from medieval Christianity. Look what happened when Eve decided to shake up the Garden of Eden. Not good. But this worldview was challenged in the Renaissance by Niccolò Machiavelli and Francis Bacon and other thinkers who promoted what they called innovation. And their new enthusiasm for innovation was incorporated into English script writing at the end of the 16th century by Christopher Marlowe, who wrote several tragic scripts about rebels with seductively forward-looking beliefs. Marlowe's tragic hero Tamburlaine challenges the feudal belief that a peasant must always remain a peasant. And Marlowe's anti-hero Dr. Faustus makes a demonic pact out of disgust with the old dated dogma of medieval schools. But Marlowe's rebel characters were still doomed to destruction because they inhabited story worlds that treated innovation as impossible. The deep rule of these tragic worlds was that life was a boom, boom, boom of the past echoing into the future. The only thing that could break this chain reaction was the divine intervention of a deus ex machina. Human innovation was a non-starter, and so both Tamburlaine and Faustus end up in hell. And then, a few years after Marlowe, Shakespeare changed the rules. In Henry IV, he introduced a man who made himself king and then passed his crown onto his son, altering the old tragic rule that the present must echo the past. Instead, the new rule became that the present could establish a fresh boom boom that echoed into the future, allowing the king's son, Henry V, to declare himself, quote, a maker of custom. In the old story world, individuals were a product of their environment. In the new story world, their environment would be a product of them. With this one simple change to the previous rules of tragedy, Shakespeare ushered in a whole new genre, the heroic, which has inspired modern Hollywood scripts as varied as Casablanca and Die Hard and Gandhi and Pulp Fiction. Just like tragic and comic story worlds, heroic story worlds can be established and innovated through the same two-part method of importing pre-established genre rules and then establishing a new rule. The one difference is that the new heroic rule is not there from the get-go of the story world. Instead, it's added to the story world over the course of the plot by the actions of a hero or heroes. Here's how it works in Lawrence of Arabia. The script opens on Lawrence's death and subsequent funeral, where his achievements are dismissed by men who never knew him. So this script begins by summoning up Hamlet's old tragic rule that men die and are forgotten, their individual who's there consigned to oblivion. But then after the funeral, Lawrence challenges this tragic rule by returning from the dead in an extended flashback that becomes the rest of the movie. And as the flashback Lawrence, acts in more and more unforgettable ways, he transforms himself into an enduring legend until finally, at the end of the script, he meets the one man who spoke well of him in the opening scene of Lawrence's future funeral. This is the first occasion in their lives the two men have ever met, but somehow Lawrence remembers the other man. How could this possibly be? Well, Lawrence's chronology-busting memory is the script's way of telling us that Lawrence has seen the opening scene of the script. He was there at his own funeral, and so really this has not been a flashback. This has been a resurrection, because Lawrence has lived beyond death, changing the tragic rule of individual destruction into a heroic rule of time-defying immortality, as if Hamlet had risen to life to recount his own story at the end of Shakespeare's script. As one final example of this heroic blueprint for world building, there's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. The script's opening beats lay out a tragic story world, a bank filled with tough new security measures designed specifically to thwart our thieving heroes. But against this tragic rule of doom, our hero Butch Cassidy responds with his heroic rule of human ingenuity. No matter how desperate the situation gets, Butch's rule is that he can always outfox it. So his life keeps getting harder and harder, raining down unlucky breaks and unfortunate circumstances, trying to force Butch to conform to the tragic rule of the world. Our hero sticks to his own rule of ingenuity, coming up with clever trick after trick to cheat death and stay alive. Until finally, in the script's last beats, Butch reveals his latest great idea as a wall of bullets is unleashed at him. And in the biggest trick of all, the screen freezes, preserving Butch forever unharmed, as his rule of ingenuity stops the future and permanently transforms the story world. The take-home here is that to create a heroic story world, you don't introduce your new heroic rule in your opening scene. Instead, you introduce the old rules of tragedy or some other familiar genre, and then you introduce a character like Lawrence or Butch Cassidy who embodies your new heroic rule and fights back against the old rule of the story world, until, in the last scene, he transforms it. So that's a pocket history of how the three big genres, the tragic, comic, and heroic, have been established and innovated. The big rule of tragedy is the return of the past. The big rule of comedy is the triumph of love. The big rule of the heroic is that heroes can change any rule. In our later lectures, we'll explore a variety of genres that go beyond the strict boundaries of our big three. But all these other genres trace their roots back in some way to the big three, just like the heroic traces its roots back to the tragic. And all of these other genres got started by the same method that generated the variety of story worlds that we've seen in this lecture. So whatever kind of story world you want to create, you can use this method too. First, import the rules of a pre-existing genre in your opening beats. Second, introduce a rule change that allows for your own original characters, plot directions, and ending. It doesn't need to be a massively original rule change. It can be a simple twist or little wrinkle on genres that have come before. But if you choose it carefully, it can open up a whole new universe of opportunities. If you'd like to practice your world building, here's a couple exercises you can try. First, analyze the opening scenes of your favorite films. How does it establish the story world? What rules does it borrow from earlier films? What new rule or rules does it establish? Second, go back to the story ending you created in the last lecture. What's its most incredible and innovative feature? In what kind of world would this ending be more plausible? What one rule makes that world different from existing story worlds? How can you establish that one rule in your opening scene? Character is the key ingredient to most successful stories. If you create an engaging character, audiences will follow her anywhere. And even more impressively, they'll even follow her nowhere. I Love Lucy and Cheers and Friends return to the same kitchen and bar and coffee shop over and over again. 12 Angry Men and Reservoir Dogs and Rear Window barely ever leave a single room. And audiences never get bored because the characters are that compelling. So what is character? Well, to start with, character sets something apart. We say a house has character when there's a unique twist to its architecture. It's not a little box on the hillside next to other little boxes that all look the same. Characters in a script are like that rogue house. Something about them is different. They're not like everyone else around. That's why, as we noted in our lecture on story worlds, scripts typically introduce world before they introduce character. The world is the standard state of affairs, the regular day-to-day, the way things usually work. So by laying out the story world first, a script provides the norm against which characters can establish their own uniqueness. Maybe the characters are idealists in a world of ruthless pragmatism. Maybe they ask questions that other people don't. Maybe like Hamlet, they're original thinkers in a world of conventional action. Maybe like Cleopatra, they're independent women in a world of domineering men. What matters is that they stick out in some way from the environment around. A person who doesn't stick out isn't a character. A minion in a global empire, not a character. Neither is a saint in heaven. In movie lingo, we call them extras because they're literally extraneous. You could replace them in your story in the same way you can replace one piece of background furniture with another. So how do you keep your characters from becoming background furniture? How do you create Hamlets and Cleopatras who grab your audience's hearts and minds and imaginations? In this lecture, we'll discover the recipe for creating compelling characters and putting them in your scripts. As we'll see, the recipe has 3 ingredient techniques. 2 are essential for every character, and the third is an optional but powerful technique you'll use all the time. After we've learned these techniques for creating characters and introducing them into scripts, we'll then finish by using a pair of Oscar-winning scripts to illustrate how the same techniques can help you cook up all of your characters' subsequent actions and dialogue, so that once you hook your audience, your characters can lead them anywhere. So let's begin with the first technique for creating characters, which is to establish the character through conflict with something else. The importance of conflict to character goes back, like everything else in script writing, to the human brain. Because brains are much, much smaller than the world we live in, they've had to develop a method for selecting what tiny slices of their environment to focus on. Like a lot of our neural architecture, this method evolved millions of years ago before humans were humans, and when life was so fragile that any moment could bring our abrupt demise. In this dangerous environment, our primordial brains survived by filtering out anything that seemed ordinary or static. Instead, they focused on things that seemed either unusual or changing, because unusual or changing things were more likely to reflect new threats or fresh opportunities. And this ancient part of our brains hasn't changed, even in the heart of modern civilization, when we often wish we could be more relaxed or mindful. Our neural circuits are still wired to set up and pay more attention to conflict. So even if your ultimate goal is to make your audience relax or laugh or love or hope or dream, you have to start by establishing conflict. Conflict sticks out. Conflict drives changes, both dangerous and door-opening. And so the brain takes special notice. Since you want your main characters to stick out most of all, their conflict should be with the entire story world. The bigness of this conflict signals the character's own importance, which is why the traditional 2-step method for beginning a script is an opening scene where minor characters introduce the rules of a story world, and a second scene that then introduces the main character in conflict with one of those rules. So the first scene of Hamlet introduces the tragic rule of its story world through Horatio and the Watchmen, and the second scene introduces the title character as he challenges the story world's rote action with his own independent thought. This means that to locate your main character's conflict, you can reverse engineer back from the rules of your story world to create a character who opposes one or more of these rules. So if you have a story world of peace and love, the reverse engineered main character could be a proponent of hate and violence. That's Richard III. If you have a story world where domineering masters rip people from the ones they love, the reverse-engineered main character could be a slave who boasts that he'll reunite a pair of broken hearts. That's the ancient comic hero, Pseudolus. If you have a story world of conquering male knights, the reverse-engineered main character could be a female who dismisses chivalry as a load of empty posturing. That's Beatrice in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Or, if you'd prefer to come up with your main character before you design your story world, just flip the process and reverse engineer the rules of your story world to oppose your main character. However you get there, the important thing is the conflict. This conflict causes characters to resist their world, unconsciously or consciously, and then either to change it or be changed by it. Which is to say, the conflict between the main characters and the story world generates the plot, which we'll get to in a future lecture. To establish smaller characters, you reverse engineer their conflicts as well. Antagonists are reverse engineered to be in conflict with the main character, which is to say that antagonists embody the rule of the story world that the main character opposes. Meanwhile, minor characters typically share the main character's conflict with the story world, only to a lesser degree. To see how all this works, take the Oscar-winning script for Moonlight, where the story world's tragic rule is the demise of empathy, the failure to care for other people as something more than sources of easy pleasure and profit. To establish its main character, Chiron, the script puts him in deep conflict with this tragic rule, showing how he strives to care for others and have them care for him. To establish the antagonists, the script introduces them heartlessly bullying the main character, so that their hardness of heart conflicts with what they see as the main character's softness. And to establish the supporting character Juan, the script introduces him when he runs to stop Chiron from being bullied, so that both Juan and the main character oppose the heartlessness of the story world with their own acts of empathy, bringing them into conflict with the same antagonists. The fact that Juan shares the main character's conflict with the story world can lead first-time readers of Moonlight's script to think that Juan must be the main character. But what ultimately makes Juan more minor is that his conflict with the story world is less intense. Even though Juan is disturbed enough by the heartlessness of the story world to regret some of his own failures of empathy, he's also able to skate by most of the time without feeling the deep shame or anger or remorse that Chiron experiences when he's abandoned by his mother, or abused by his closest friend, or arrested for violently attacking a bully. So the general rule of thumb for introducing minor characters is to show that they feel the same conflict with the story world as the main character, but experience it less deeply. There are slightly different rules for creating characters in TV scripts, but we'll see in our later lectures on TV writing. But TV characters, like all characters, are also introduced by conflict, because conflict is what makes the brain take notice. So that's the first big technique for creating and introducing characters. Conflict, conflict, conflict. And here's the second big technique. Reverse engineer the deep fear that drives the character into conflict. Because fear is the deepest psychological level of every character, the force that propels them to act as they do. This might seem a rather dark view of characters. We might prefer to think of them more positively, as dreamers, or hopers, or lovers. But when you're building your characters, you want to think of them primarily as creatures of fear, for two biological reasons. First, fears are the most powerful drivers of human behavior. Our hopes and desires are essential for us to thrive. But before we can thrive, we first need to stay alive. And because our fears are our guardians against death and destruction, they motivate our most revealing, urgent, and extraordinary acts. What shatters our social performances and the lies we tell ourselves, exposing the hidden true depths of our souls? What causes us to dash into burning buildings, or climb into cockpits, or face down our enemies? It's our fears of losing someone or something we can't live without. The second, and no less important reason to build your characters out of their fears, is because these fears are what cognitively binds audiences to characters, making them care. The neuroscience behind this bonding process is complex, but we can glimpse its big outlines by looking at the biological origins of human society. As we've already noted, our brains have limited processing power, and so no human ever gets far alone. To succeed, we need to work together, establishing symbiotic relationships of mutual give and take that allow us to pool our neural resources, taking advantage of our different abilities and experiences. But these cooperative relationships are also potentially dangerous because they expose us to being exploited or betrayed or having our hearts broken. So before we partner with someone, we have to feel sure that we can trust them. And to help us decide who to trust, our brains hone in on people's fears. Fears are emotional vulnerabilities, sites of ongoing need. So if we know what someone needs at the deepest levels of their psyches, then we have a way to predict and control their behavior. Even if a person is a liar, a cheat, and a thief, our brains are willing to trust him and admit him into our society as long as we can see his deep fears, because then we know what he needs emotionally from us. That's why scripts can encourage audiences to care for even dangerous and antisocial characters like Richard III, or Tony Soprano, or Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones. The key is simply to reveal the character's deep fears, showing the audience what makes them vulnerable. So after you reverse engineer your character's conflict, the next step is to reverse engineer their deep fear. What kind of fear could drive a man to hate a time of love? He would have to be afraid that his physical appearance makes him unlovable. That's Shakespeare's Richard III. What kind of fear could drive a slave to disobey his master? A fear of losing his own self-respect. That's the comic character Pseudolus again. And what kind of fear could drive a woman to mock male courtesy? A fear of having her heart broken, again by empty promises. That's Beatrice in Much Ado. Then, after you reverse engineer this deep fear, lay a quick beat into your script to reveal it right after you introduce your character. A simple gesture or moment of dialogue is enough to establish the fear. Thanks to millions of years of evolution, your audience's brains are finely tuned to pick out other people's vulnerabilities. And if you want to deepen your audience's empathy for that character, simply put the character in moments that intensify and expose their fear. So those are the two most time-tested techniques for creating characters. First, establish their conflict, and second, reveal the fear that drives it. Those two techniques are all you need for any character, no matter how minor or major, no matter how admirable or ugly their actions might be. If you establish conflict and emotional vulnerability, audiences will care. But if you want to take another step and encourage your audience to make an even deeper emotional investment in your characters, there's a third optional technique you can use. Our first two techniques encourage audiences to feel for a character. That is, they encourage what story scientists call empathy. The optional third technique encourages audiences to identify with a character. That is, it goes beyond empathy and into what story scientists call sympathy. Empathy and sympathy have colloquial meanings, but in our lectures, we'll use these two terms in a rigorous technical sense. Empathy is when you feel for a character. Sympathy is when you feel with a character. So let's say that the character feels fear. If you have empathy for the character, then you feel sorrow or pity or outrage for her fear. But if you have sympathy for the character, then you literally feel her fear. You tremble when she trembles. In other words, when we feel sympathy, we identify with the character, so that we don't simply care about the character's fears and dreams and desires, we share those fears and dreams and desires, experiencing them like they're our own. This is the most powerful kind of psychological connection a script can engineer. And here's the secret blueprint for doing it. You write a soliloquy. The term soliloquy has a number of casual connotations, but we'll always use it in these lectures in its strict technical sense as a moment where a character expresses a conflict between two deep fears. A soliloquy is both a dialogue and a monologue. A dialogic monologue, a back and forth that one character has with himself, as his two deepest fears vie against each other. So a soliloquy shows that a character isn't just afraid of one thing, the character is caught between two things that he fears. The cognitive reasons that soliloquies generate sympathy are too complex for us to delve into here. But basically, soliloquies hack our neural mechanisms of self-awareness, prompting our brains to misidentify a character's conflict as our own. Writers have known about this secret method of generating sympathy since around the time of Shakespeare. When Hamlet soliloquizes, "to be or not to be," he's vocalizing an inner conflict between his two deepest fears. One, that he'll become a beast in the name of honor, and two, that he'll become a coward in the name of conscience. So Hamlet is afraid of losing his humanity and acting like a brute, but he's also afraid of losing his self-respect and acting like a hypocrite. To be or not to be, his two most primal fears clashing in a soliloquy. Hamlet is such a legendarily sympathetic character that we can forget that he's not obviously likable. He abuses his mother, murders an innocent man, mocks a grieving brother, and drives his girlfriend into a fatal mental breakdown. Yet because of the power of the soliloquy, generations of spectators have felt the prince's sorrow as their own. And Hamlet's soliloquy recipe for encouraging sympathy is used all the time in scripts today, particularly in TV. As we'll discuss in our lecture on MASH, TV focuses heavily on depicting conflict within characters, so it's generated some of the most legendarily sympathetic characters of our own era. Tony Soprano is torn between his fear of being too weak to protect his family and his fear that the things he does to seem strong will cost him his family anyway. Buffy the Vampire Slayer is torn between her fear of missing out on a normal high school experience and her fear that if she gives in to teen desire, she'll become as selfishly destructive as any soul-sucking vampire. Omar Little, from The Wire, is torn between his fear of losing the game and his fear that if he plays it too well, he'll lose himself. He feels that he's got to be ruthlessly flexible, double-crossing anyone on either side of the law. And he also feels that he's got to stick to his own individual code, never cursing or killing innocents, and always escorting his grandma to church. This conflict of fears can even be found in animated characters like Homer Simpson. Homer's not always a sympathetic character, but when he is, it's because he's torn by self-doubt. Like Buffy, he's afraid of missing out on all the fun, but like Tony Soprano, he's also afraid of letting down his family. Most of these TV characters aren't obviously likable. Just like Hamlet, they can be violent, vainly self-obsessed, melodramatic, absurd, and horrifically cruel. But when we see them in moments of inner conflict, we find ourselves identifying with them. To create these moments of sympathy, modern scripts occasionally include full-blown traditional soliloquies, like in the Oscar-winning script for Birdman, where Regan argues with his superhero alter ego, torn between his fear that he won't be respected as an artist and his fear of being a nobody. But modern scripts are also filled with clever ways to mimic soliloquies, like The Sopranos does with Tony's therapy sessions, or like Sex and the City does with voiceover. Voiceover is often mistakenly accused of being a writer's crutch, but it's an incredibly useful tool for generating sympathy. Watch an episode of The Wonder Years, or Scrubs, or My So-Called Life, and you'll see. And scripts can also simulate soliloquies simply by showing a character acting in a conflicted way. If a character hesitates outside a door, or buys a gift and then throws it out, or goes on dates with two very different people, that can prompt the viewer to imagine the unspoken conflict of fears in the character's mind, triggering a moment of identification. And that's why at the end of the first part of Moonlight, when Juan hangs his head, showing that he's torn without ever saying it, our hearts open up in sympathy. Since soliloquies are so powerful, you'll be tempted to use them all the time. And as we'll see in our later lectures, there are certain kinds of scripts that make almost all of their characters sympathetic, even the antagonists. This is the blueprint for sentimental romances like Casablanca, and for most TV shows, including soap operas, sitcoms, and even serial dramas like Game of Thrones. But more sympathy isn't always better. And many powerful scripts don't use sympathy at all. That's because, as we'll see in later lectures, sympathy is less effective than simple empathy at generating certain other cognitive effects. So don't fall into the trap of thinking that sympathy is always better than empathy. From a storytelling perspective, they're just different tools with different uses. Now that we've learned the trick for creating sympathy, we've got all three of our big techniques for introducing characters. First, introduce characters in a moment of conflict. For your main character, this conflict is with a rule of the story world. Second, reveal the deep fear that drives the character into conflict. And third, if you want to generate sympathy, show how the character's conflict with the world has triggered a conflict with his own mind, pitting two deep fears against each other. But of course, creating and introducing a character is only the beginning. After that, there's every action that they have to perform and every word that they have to say. So how do you write all of these story beats and their accompanying dialogue? Well, you write it all by returning to our three big techniques. Because to know what your characters will do or say in any given moment, you have to enter their minds. And the way to enter a character's mind is to experience their deep conflicts by tapping into the fears that drive them. By sharing in a character's fears, you can sense what's at stake for them in any situation, allowing you to gauge how they'll act and react. You'll step into their shoes, see the world through their eyes, and grasp what they want to do. And even more remarkably, by tapping into a character's fears, you can also imagine all their dialogue. That dialogue contains two broad elements. The first is the underlying intention of the dialogue, the action that the character is trying to accomplish. The second is the particular nouns and verbs and other words that the character uses to put that intention into effect. You can find both of these dialogue elements by tapping into your character's fears. The first element of dialogue, the character's intention, is an action like any other action. It's an attempt to push away some bad outcome with another better one. So if you can feel the bad things that the character is pushing against, you can also feel the good things that the character is trying to push toward. The second element of dialogue, your character's particular word choices, might not seem so obviously linked to the character's fears, but really it is. To start with, some of these words are carefully selected by characters to achieve their immediate objectives. And so by tapping into your character's fears, you can discover what words they'll use or avoid when they're concerned about incriminating themselves, or antagonizing someone, or revealing how they secretly feel. Then there are the less conscious parts of your character's speech. Your character's natural dialect, for example, or his rhythms of diction. These may seem to have nothing at all to do with the character's anxieties and self-doubts. But in fact, they were forged long ago out of the character's earlier struggles to define himself against the things in his world that he was afraid of becoming. That's why in many cases a character's vocabulary and diction and patterns of speech reflect a kind of anxious overcompensation. A character who's afraid of being an academic failure will talk with an eccentrically outsized vocabulary learned through secret hours of study. A character who's afraid of being inauthentic will talk with more of a local dialect and even a hometown twang. A character who's afraid of being uncool will have a mind filled with archaeological layers of slang. As a quick example of how this works, let's say you were a cop like Edmund Exley in the script for LA Confidential. Your conscious fear is not measuring up to your dad, who is a legend on the force. So you go out of your way to do everything by the book. Long before the script started, you'd have trained yourself to talk in bloodless language, like a typed report. Other characters around you would drop the F-bomb and use colorful expressions like, "Guy's got a pole so far up his ass, every time he farts, the flag waves." But your natural vocabulary and syntax would be dull and colorless, to the point that the script introduces you at a moment where you're talking in police procedural, while another character is repeating the word penis. But then, later in the script, as you become more and more afraid that your by-the-book approach is hurting your ability to be a good cop, you put on a tough guy act in an interrogation and drop the F-bomb yourself. Until finally, at the end of the script, when you think you're about to get killed, you quietly curse. Because in this moment, your primal fear of death overwhelms the professional anxieties that led you to talk so religiously by the book. In that micro example from the script for LA Confidential, you can see how a character's deep fears shape every element of their speech, from their usual vocabulary to their conscious performances, and finally, to their unguarded emotional utterances. And to give you a more in-depth look at how fears can shape all these elements of a character's speech, let's wrap this lecture by turning to one of the most spectacular instances of dialogue in screenwriting history, the opening scene of The Social Network. In this scene, Mark Zuckerberg is explaining to his girlfriend Erica that he wants to do something of substance with his life. so he needs to get into one of Harvard's elite clubs. Meanwhile, Erica is doing her best to be polite, but she wants to get away from Mark as quickly as possible. So the underlying intention of the dialogue is all rooted in the character's social anxieties. Mark is afraid of being dismissed as a small fish. Erica is concerned about being what she calls an a-hole, that is, someone who rudely imposes their own perspective on others. And both of these social anxieties stem from the character's deeper personal fears. Mark is frightened of being powerless, a nobody. Erica is afraid of being friendless and alone. So his deep fear is being unrespected. Her deep fear is being unloved. And as you immediately see when reading the script, the character's fears shape more than the underlying intent of the character's dialogue. These fears also shape the character's specific words. Mark's concerns about being low status have prompted him to memorize the minute details of Harvard's obscure social hierarchies. He knows that Theodore Roosevelt was a member of Porcellian, or as the in-crowd call it, the Pork. And he knows that it's final clubs, not finals clubs. These esoteric details are salted throughout his dialogue, revealing a lifetime of anxiety that has bubbled forth in obsessive research. Meanwhile, Erica talks in a more polished, formal style of someone who cares about public decorum. Even though she doesn't respect what Mark is saying, she still talks with respect because she spent years of her life learning how to present herself politely so that she can avoid becoming a friendless a-hole. And here's how that all comes together in the first dialogue beats of the scene.
Did you know there are more people with genius IQs living in China than there are people of any kind living in the United States?
That can't possibly be true.
It is.
What would account for that?
Well, first, an awful lot of people live in China. But here's my question. How do you distinguish yourself in a population of people who all got 1,600 on their SATs?
I didn't know they take the SATs in China.
They don't. I wasn't talking about China anymore. I was talking about me.
Mark's dialogue starts with him talking simultaneously about multiple subjects at once, as he tries to lord over China and America and all the knowledge in the world in order to demonstrate his vast intellectual substance. Until at the end, his true object of concern is revealed: me. Because that's what motivates his globe-trotting data dump, his own egoistic fear that he won't distinguish himself. Meanwhile, Erica's dialogue is an effort to politely keep up with Mark's many-pronged verbal assault. She engages with each of Mark's ideas, never introducing ideas of her own, and using courteous formal expressions like "can't possibly" and "what could account for," and the other sorts of excessively proper speech you might employ if you were attempting to practice restraint and talk respectfully to a social bore. These patterns of dialogue continue over the scene in more and more elaborate form, before finally ending in conversation beats like,
I think we should just be friends.
I don't want friends.
I was being polite. I have no intention of being friends with you.
And once again, you can see the character's deep fears driving the intention of the dialogue. Erica is afraid of being an a-hole, so she works to be polite. Mark is afraid of being insubstantial, so he wants more than friends. And the same fears drive the two characters' word choices. Mark is terrified of seeming like a nobody, so he talks casually, like only the boss can do, clipping and contracting his syntax. Erica is concerned about being rude, so she talks more formally. Someone more relaxed or direct would drop the "I think" or the "with you," or use simpler words than intention or being. But Erica maintains her polite diction even as she pulls back the curtain into how she really feels. And there you see how every beat of dialogue in this scene stems ultimately from the character's underlying fears, because these fears are the deepest part of what makes the characters themselves. So when you're writing dialogue, tap into your character's conscious and unconscious mind by tapping into their deep anxieties and insecurities. Build your character's vocabulary and general rhythms of speech by thinking back to their past, when they forged their habits of self-expression to define themselves against the things they feared the most, quite possibly overcompensating. And then create the character's verbal intention in the moment by identifying what concerns them most right now. That bad feeling or problem or failure they want to talk their way out of into something better. So that's how the 3 simple techniques that we've learned in this lecture can help you introduce characters and then create all of their actions and their dialogue. You don't need to worry about sticking to certain archetypal characters or about making your characters likable or anything like that. Audiences have flexible enough brains to connect to any character, no matter how original or unlikable, as long as you introduce the character through conflict and dramatize the character's main fears. That's why Pixar's early scripts can make us care about post-apocalyptic robots and kitchen rats and monsters from a nightmare. It's not about the intrinsic qualities of the characters. It's about the technique you use to introduce the characters. So when it comes to character, our 3 techniques are everything, with one closing caveat. The more we talk about characters in technical terms, styling ourselves as their grand engineers, the more we can lose sight of the specialness of every individual character we create. And we don't ever want to look down on our characters or think that they're made up of interchangeable parts from some big literary scrap heap. Although we might talk about major and minor characters, or heroes and villains, or straight men and clowns, characters don't think this way. Every villain is the hero of her own story. Every minor character is the major protagonist of his own life. Even the most ludicrous comic characters don't find themselves funny. They think everything they say or do is completely logical. So don't get too high above your characters. Invest them all with their own individual conflicts and fears, so that when they enter the story, they seem authentic, dynamic, striving, vulnerable, just like you and me. If you'd like to practice creating characters, here's 2 exercises that you can try. First, imagine a conflict between a person and their story world. Maybe the person is a questioner in a totalitarian society, or a liar in the halls of truth, or a rationalist in a culture of feeling. Now outline a scene where you draw attention to this character by dramatizing the conflict. Second, write a short scene that reveals the fear that drives your character's conflict. Or if you want to be more ambitious, the 2 fears that the character is pulled between. Tap into this fear or fears to help you craft the character's conscious verbal intentions, their unconscious dialect, and every other aspect of their dialogue. And once you've made one character, make more. Because of all the things you can create, nothing will give your audience more meaning or delight. You might have heard the old legend of Cassandra. She was cursed with always being right, but never having anyone believe her. Unfortunately, Cassandra isn't just an old legend, because you're about to become her. As a screenwriter, you know what's best for the story. You've thought about it inside and out. You know what works and what the audience wants. But if you work in film, get prepared to be overruled, or worse, fired and replaced by another writer. So even though you think you know the story best, don't think that you'll be the one to tell the producers or the director what to do. That's why one of the most basic rules of screenwriting is not to include specific shots or camera work or in other ways attempt to direct the film. You write the film, you don't direct it. But don't fret about your subordinate role too much, because even though you're not in charge, you've still got a powerful way to get your point across. And it's called tone. Tone is the way a story is told. It's the voice of the storyteller, real or implied. And it's so powerful that you can flip an entire story simply by changing the tone. Audiences laugh when the Three Stooges get their eyes gouged. Not so much when it happens to poor King Oedipus. It's the same story beat, but the tone determines whether we grimace or smile. And there are endless ways to modulate a story's tone. You can communicate any perspective, no matter how subtle or strange, if you strike the right tone. because tone is the screenwriter's version of a camera lens. It shapes the way your audience sees the story. And really, it's a lot better than a camera, because you get to use it long before any camera starts to roll. So you can subtly influence the producer and the director, showing them how you think the story should be told. In this lecture, we'll explore how to use tone to put your script in the best position to get its unique voice across. First, we'll learn the main tool that screenwriters use to establish tone. And second, we'll learn the fundamentals of 4 popular screenwriting tones: the God's Eye, the ironic, the comic, and the sentimental. For practical purposes, our introductory examples of these 4 tones won't be taken from screenplays. Tone in screenplays is subtle and harder to detect. So to start with, we'll focus on novels and narrative poems, where the tone is strong and easy to see, before illustrating each of our literary tones with a short snippet from 10 Oscar-winning films. So let's start by exploring the main tool that writers use to create tone. Tone is a cognitive effect that comes to be in the minds of your audience. And like every effect, it has a cause, which in this case is a literary device known as the narrator. The narrator is the person who tells you the story. Sometimes that storyteller is explicit, like when Moby Dick begins, "Call me Ishmael." Sometimes that storyteller is implied, like when A Tale of Two Cities announces out of nowhere, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." But every story is told by someone, and so whether or not that teller identifies herself, the words are coming from her mouth. She is the narrator. In scripts, narrators are usually hidden out of sight, glimpsed indirectly through ripples in the text. But even in scripts, the narrator is everywhere, because every story beat, every scene and character description, every action and transition has to be voiced by someone. And that someone is the narrator you create. They can be some version of yourself, maybe a more wryly ironic, or heartfelt, or worldly wise you. Or they can be a complete performance, a whole new character that you step into when you sit down to write. Although the narrator inflects every instant of a script, including every word of every character's dialogue, the narrator's voice is most evident in scene and action and character descriptions. And most screenplays establish their storytelling voice strongly up front. So if you're analyzing a screenplay for its narrator, start by looking for the opening description beats. And if you want to establish your own tone in a script, make your narrator's voice as strong as possible in your opening scene and character descriptions. There are many ways that your character can shape the tone, but from a screenwriting perspective, the 2 most important ways are what your narrator focuses on and how they focus on it. What and how. What and how. What and how. Let's start with the what. When a narrator describes a physical space, he or she chooses what to focus on by emphasizing certain objects and de-emphasizing or even ignoring others. For example, if a narrator describes a home, he won't give equal time to all the rooms in that home. He might emphasize the living room or the kitchen, styling the house as a space of family togetherness. Or he might emphasize the spare bedroom or a study in the attic, instead subtly portraying the home as a place of solitude or even apartness. The narrator can also subtly shift the tone by focusing on certain objects within an individual room. For example, let's take a kitchen. If the narrator emphasizes the stove and the sink, the kitchen comes to seem a space of labor. But if the narrator emphasizes the table and the chairs, the kitchen becomes a space of community and sharing. Or if the narrator emphasizes an original copy of the United States Constitution, or a rusty axe, or something that's not ordinarily in a kitchen, the kitchen becomes a place of curiosity and suspense. The same goes for the people in the rooms. If a narrator focuses on a person's clothes, it creates a public sense of social place. If a narrator focuses on a person's eyes, it creates a more private sense of intimacy. So for example, when the script for A Room with a View introduces Mr. Emerson, the romantic, rule-breaking, middle-aged father, it tells us, quote, "Mr. Emerson, an elderly, plump gentleman with childlike eyes, has his mouth full and so can only wave his fork cheerily." In the detail of Mr. Emerson's eyes, we feel we immediately know his heart. So the narrator urges us to trust Mr. Emerson and his childlike impulses. even when they lead us into flouting social niceties and waving our silverware with our mouths full. And then, when the narrator hides the eyes of Mr. Emerson's son, George, telling us that he, quote, doesn't look up from his plate at all, we suddenly feel like part of George's heart is being concealed, creating an atmosphere of intrigue that prepares for George to become an object of romantic interest. A narrator can do all that and more simply by choosing what to describe. And as a narrator, you do have to choose. You can't describe everything. You need to filter. And by filtering, you shape the tone. Your brain does this naturally all the time. If every time you walked into a room you focused with equal attention on everything in the room, you'd never get out of the room. You'd spend your whole day there. So your brain filters every room through your needs and desires. If you step into a new hotel room when your brain is tired, it might focus automatically on the bed. If you step into the same room when your brain is excited, it might guide you to step to the window and look outside, anticipating a view that matches your mood. And this is, of course, what a camera does in a movie. It tells the audience what's important by focusing on certain objects instead of others. Visually, through what it looks at, it shapes the audience's sense of what matters. It functions as a narrator, establishing a particular point of view. So when you're writing a screenplay, take advantage of this selecting method. Don't describe everything in every room and on every character. Carefully choose what you include. And when you're analyzing a piece of writing to borrow its tone, take notice of what places and objects the narrative records and what ones it ignores. If you make similar choices in your own writing, you'll generate the same tone. So that's the what of the narrator. And so now let's turn to the other part, the how. The how is the way you describe the objects that you focus on. What descriptive words do you select instead of others? Do you use technical terms or slang? If you describe a soldier firing an M203 grenade launcher, it feels like you're observing him neutrally, like a professional journalist. If you describe the same weapon as a 40 mic, it feels like you're closer emotionally to the soldier, like you're not just looking at him, but seeing the weapon through his eyes. Do you use warmer adjectives or cooler ones? If you describe a book as well-thumbed, it implies fondness and respect, suggesting that the book is a beloved object, an important emotional or intellectual resource. If you instead describe the same book as worn and battered, it implies shabbiness and disrepair, suggesting that the book is a sign of a world or a mind that's falling apart. Do you avoid adverbs entirely and opt for a more laconic style? Do you make your verbs more active or passive? Do you describe objects as they are, or instead as your characters see them? There's a lot you can do with the how, so to organize our options, let's turn now to a few hugely influential screenwriting tones. In each case, we'll begin with a literary example that clearly establishes the tone, and then we'll touch on 2 or 3 major Hollywood scripts that deploy it. To demonstrate how powerful tone can be, let's start with a tone that can make you into a god. Any god you can imagine. Any god you want to be. This tone is known as the God's Eye. A God's Eye narrator has the properties of a divine eye, all-seeing and all-knowing. It's above the things it describes. It sees into their essence and has dominion over them. Here's how the God's Eye narrator works in the King James Version of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. In terms of the what, you'll notice that this particular narrator ignores everything except for the most massive objects: God, heaven, earth, the deep, the waters. And the result is to create a sense of giganticism. Small things are beneath this narrator. Intimate details are not of consequence. Now let's look at the how. You'll notice that this narrator avoids adjectives and adverbs to instead concentrate on simple nouns: beginning, heaven, earth, form, void, darkness, face, waters, light. So this kind of narrator cuts to the quick of the objects. It selects their crucial properties. It doesn't bother with surface details like the quality of the light or the beauty of the earth. It's direct and matter-of-fact, like a god peering past your outward flourishes into the truth of your soul. This impression of the narrator's clinical objectivity is then reinforced by the constant linking of sentences with the word and. So this God's eye is so powerful and omnipresent that it sees everything simultaneously. And it's so objective and removed that it doesn't privilege or subordinate one detail to another. It possesses total balance and equanimity. So that's a God's eye narrator. But that's not the only way of doing a God's eye narrator, because there are different ways of imagining what a God might see. The God of Genesis is austere, sublime. But at roughly the same time that the Old Testament was being written down, the ancient Greeks were creating more emotional, less distant gods. The results of this different God's eye can be seen in the opening lines of Homer's Iliad, which go like this. Sing, goddess, of the all-damaging anger of Achilles, born of Peleus, that brought countless pains to men, sending many stout souls to Hades before their time, making heroes into food for dogs and vultures. You'll notice that the what and the how of this narrator are quite different from the what and the how of the biblical narrator. Some of the what is still very big objects. We have Hades and we have a goddess. But we also have smaller objects like food and dogs and vultures. And many of these objects are plural, pains and men and souls and heroes. So there isn't one pain or one hero that matters above all. This isn't about cutting to the essence in the same way as the Old Testament God. The eye we see through is a little fuzzier, a little weaker, a little less exact in time and in place. In other words, it's still a very powerful eye, but it's not the absolute and only eye. In keeping with the Greeks' polytheism, this God's eye is one among many. It communicates a sense of strength without insisting upon its own totality. It's more subjective and more limited. Reinforcing this polytheistic what is the how, which is rich in descriptive adjectives. The Homeric narrator tells us about stout souls and countless pains, creating a sense of greater emotional intimacy with the mortal world below. And to reinforce this feeling, one of the narrator's adjectives is a poetic coinage, all-damaging. Anytime you coin a new word or phrase, you convey a sense of special importance. And in the case of Homer's Iliad, the important thing is the anger of Achilles, placing special value on earthly feeling. So in the Iliad and in Genesis, you have two different blueprints for a God's eye narrator, both of which have had a deep influence on Hollywood screenwriting. The tone of the Oscar-nominated script for Star Wars draws heavily on an Old Testament style. The script opens by declaring, "A vast sea of stars serves as the backdrop for the main title. War drums echo through the heavens." So the nouns used by this narrator are simpler and more general. The focus is on stars and the heavens and on gigantic things, and the adjectives are spare and remote. Meanwhile, the tone of Unforgiven is more Homeric, maintaining a focus on the big things of life and death, but slipping in some earthly adjectives and human objects to give the script a warmer touch. That's why Unforgiven's original script ends with this line. "The eyes of the husband and the pig farmer and the man who shot down 5 men in the big whiskey saloon." So like an almighty deity, this narrator comprehends past and present together in a divine glance. And it sees all three sides of our hero in one, husband and pig farmer and man. But this narrator also has a little of the human interest of the Iliad's Greek gods. It creates a sense of intimacy by showing us a person's eyes. And it tells us that its epic story went down in the colorfully evocative Big Whiskey Saloon. So that's how the God's eye narrator works. And making you into an omnipotent deity is just the beginning of what tone can do, because there's an endless variety of other narrators that you can use. So to ground you in the big possibilities, we'll complete this lecture by surveying the 3 other most common script writing narrators: the ironic, the comic, and the sentimental. The most ancient of these is the ironic narrator, which goes back thousands of years to ancient Greek and Roman satire. The ironic narrator gently deflates and undercuts the things she describes. Like the God's eye narrator, she gets to the heart of things. But she doesn't do so to create a sense of wonder or deep meaning. She does the reverse, wryly suggesting that things are less important than we tend to think. There's no better example of this kind of narrator than in the novels of Jane Austen. Here are the opening lines of Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth, universally acknowledged, that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered the rightful property of someone or other of their daughters. So like the God's Eye narrator, Austen's ironic narrator gives us the big things of the cosmos, like truth. But she also focuses on the low drama of furniture and country marriages and all the other trivial things of human life. The things that consume our daily attention and seem of vital importance, but when put in a bigger context appear mildly ridiculous. That's because the how of the ironic narrator is to make suggestive juxtapositions between big things and little ones. So Austen's narrator places a truth universally acknowledged next to a single man. She places rightful property next to someone or other. In short, she puts the titanic and the absolute beside the minor and the afterthought, inviting the reader to see just how trivial the trivial is. The effect is like holding up a mountain to a pebble. Without ever judging directly, the narrator's manner of presentation encourages the audience to judge and to smirk a little in contempt. So if you want to recreate Austen's tone of light irony, follow her narrator's method of dry understatement. Apply a God's eye to trivial things, placing the splendid next to the humdrum in ways that call attention to the gentle shabbiness of the things your script describes. Here's how the script for The Big Short does it in its opening lines. A bunch of fat bond traders eat deli sandwiches and smoke cigarettes on the Solomon Brothers bond trading floor. It's not exactly Michael Douglas in Wall Street. So the mountain here is Michael Douglas in Wall Street, and the pebble is the bunch of chubby traders eating ham on rye. Or here's a tragically ironic character description from the narrator of The Departed. A sad, elegant working man. The way you can get them in Boston. IQ of 200 and still working for the phone company. So here the mountain is the 200 IQ, and the pebble is the phone company. If you like ironic narrators, we'll get more examples in our lectures on The Princess Bride, Fargo, and CSI. All of them employ the same basic what and how of Austen's Pride and Prejudice, with their own little twists and tweaks. The next kind of narrator is the comic. The comic is sometimes confused with the ironic narrator because it can contain lightly satiric elements. But unlike the ironic, the primary purpose of the comic is not to tear down. Instead, it's to lift up and celebrate the little curiosities of life. So while the comic narrator may mock curiosity-killing things like pride and hypocrisy, it never laughs at the low and the humble. It laughs with them, reveling in their oddball quirks and charms. One classic comic narrator who's had a huge influence on film and TV is Huck Finn from Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Here's how Huck tells a story. All the streets and lanes was just mud. They weren't nothing else but mud. Mud as black as tar, and nigh about a foot deep in some places, and 2 or 3 inches deep in all the places. The hogs loafed and grunted around everywheres. You'd see a muddy sow and a litter of pigs come lazying along the street and wallop herself right down in the way, as happy as if she was on salary. The what of this narrator is an intimate focus on the humblest of things. The narrator doesn't just mention the mud. He gets down low enough to describe its exact color and inches. So unlike the God's Eye narrator, which focuses on nobler things, and unlike the ironic narrator, which focuses on both high and low together, the comic narrator focuses entirely on the low, on the muck and the inconsequence. And to celebrate these lowly things, the narrator uses cheerful street slang and dialect phrases like, they weren't nothing else, and lazying along, and happy as if she was on salary. And he also uses fun-sounding words like wallop, using an abundantly visceral style to convey what it feels like in the mud, to flop down happily like a pig without a care. At the most basic level, this commitment to communicating how the world feels through different eyes is why romantic comedies almost always focus on both romantic partners. It's not about one experience of love, but about two experiences, because the world is not the world of a single God's eye, but of the varied experiences of daily life. Almost every sitcom or romantic comedy uses a comic narrator, and you can find one fantastic model in the script for Little Miss Sunshine, which begins with a happy catalog of grungy characters. The script opens by introducing 6-year-old Olive with her frizzy hair and black-rimmed glasses as she earnestly imitates Miss America's wave. Then the script hops to 40-something Cheryl as she inhales nicotine and promises to pick up a bucket of chicken. And then it hops to 80-year-old Grandpa as he snorts heroin and chills on the toilet. And then it hops to 15-year-old Dwayne as he pumps iron and reads Nietzsche. So just like Huck Finn, the narrator of Little Miss Sunshine gets up close and personal with a rich cast of lowly folk as they wallow in varied fleshly pursuits, from pageants to drugs, to fast food to power. Or here's how the script for Juno establishes a comic tone in its opening lines. Juno is 16 years old, an artfully bedraggled burnout kid. She winces and shields her eyes from the glare of the sun. The object of her rapt attention is a battered living room set, abandoned curbside by its former owners. There is a fetid-looking leather recliner, a chrome-edged coffee table, and a tasteless latch-hook rug featuring a roaring tiger. So just like Mark Twain lets us look through a hog's eye into the pleasures of the mud, Juno lets us look through a 16-year-old's eyes into the joys of abandoned furniture, using phrases like artfully bedraggled and chrome-edged coffee table to give us a sense of the fun to be had in everyday life. So that's the comic narrator, and we have time for just one more, the sentimental narrator. Historically, the sentimental narrator is the most common kind of narrator in screenwriting. The aim of the sentimental narrator is to speak the language of the heart. And since different hearts feel different things in different intensities and degrees, there's a huge variety in sentimental narrators. To give you a sense of the top possibilities available, here's a narrator from Toni Morrison's Pulitzer-winning Beloved. He stands in the back, near the cold house, amazed by the riot of late summer flowers where vegetables should be growing. Sweet William, Morning Glory, chrysanthemums. The odd placement of cans jammed with the rotting stems of things, the blossoms shriveled like sores. Dead ivy twines around beanpoles and door handles. Faded newspaper pictures are nailed to the outhouse and on trees. A rope too short for anything but skip jumping lies discarded near the washtub, and jars of dead lightning bugs. Like a child's house, the house of a very tall child. So the what of this narrator is the ordinary material things of life, the planted flowers, the newspapers, the outhouse. And in fact, the what of this narrator is so narrowly focused that it tightens beyond the things of ordinary life to include the things of one ordinary life. The oddly placed cans, the dead ivy on beanpoles, and the fireflies suffocated in jars. This particular collection of things can be found nowhere else in the world. They're like the specific toys in one child's room, or the particular books on one writer's shelf. Why do these specific things matter so much? Well, it's because they're the things that the individual heart cares about. The child cares about his individual toys. The writer cares about her individual books. And sentimental narrators care about their individual characters. So they notice the specific things that their characters love, and the specific things that their characters fear. And it's not just the what of the sentimental narrator that creates this sense of emotional closeness, it's also the how. To communicate a sense of intimacy, the sentimental narrator uses richly specific adjectives, like odd and rotting and faded. And she also uses personifications to imply that inanimate objects have animate minds. So she describes the house as cold, not just temperature-wise, but emotionally. And she also speaks in metaphors that communicate a precise way of feeling about things. Blossoms shriveled like sores, and like a child's house, the house of a very tall child. So like the comic narrator, the sentimental narrator emphasizes the importance of human life. But unlike the comic narrator, the sentimental narrator focuses on more serious emotions: sadness, love, nostalgia, hope. Because where the comic narrator wants us to delight in our wild variety, the sentimental narrator wants us to feel a deeper empathy for one special beating heart. You can find an example of the sentimental narrator in the script for Precious, which paints the title character's feelings onto the world with lines like, "The door closing behind Precious might as well be to a prison cell block." Or in the opening lines of Brokeback Mountain, which tell us, "Across the plain, perhaps yet some 20 miles away, a sprinkle of lights like fallen stars on the vast, dark plain." Or in the opening scenes of Slumdog Millionaire, where the script reads, "The ceiling fan thumps round slowly. In the corner, Sergeant Snirivas mops his brow and lights a cigarette. Hot work." In our lecture on Casablanca, we'll discover a clever twist on the sentimental narrator, the closeted sentimentalist who holds in his feelings until suddenly they burst out in a moment of empathy. And even scripts that aren't sentimental will often deploy some sentimental focus on individual human feeling to boost the emotional significance of a story beat, making it more vivid with richly specific adjectives, personifications, and metaphor. So there you have 4 common types of screenwriting narrator, each of which creates a different kind of tone through a different use of what and how. The God's Eye narrator is unified and all high above. The comic narrator is multifarious and all low. The ironic narrator juxtaposes high and low. The sentimental narrator invests ordinary things with human feeling. This list of narrators isn't meant as an exhaustive catalog. As we've seen, there are many subvarieties within each broad type of narrator, and there are also many other types out there for you to discover. To expand your library of storytelling possibilities, you can also splice together different narrators. Romantic comedies, for example, often use a more comic tone in the beginning and a more sentimental tone at the end. Or you can combine an ironic narrator and a God's Eye, as we'll see in the script for Fargo. But these 4 big blueprints can get you started on developing your own screenwriting voice, enabling you to take control of the what and the how of storytelling, injecting subtle forms of mood and atmosphere into scene descriptions, actions, and even plot and dialogue. In our following lectures on film and TV scripts, we'll go through specific examples of over a dozen different ways of doing this. We'll explore some different varieties of the 4 classic tones: God's Eye, ironic, comic, and sentimental. And we'll also sample a few rarer kinds of narrator, like the Brechtian and the surreal. And if you want to discover and develop the tone of your screenwriting, there's no better way than by continuing the method of this lecture and studying your favorite novelists, poets, essayists, and memoirists. Because by importing their narrative what and how into your screenplays, you can enrich your stories with any tone you choose. Joyful, tragic, hard-boiled, wryly funny, intimate, absurd. It's your camera, so you can direct your script the way you see it. If you'd like to practice writing tone, here's a couple short exercises you can try. First, read a few sentences from your favorite novelist or essayist, identifying the what and the how of their narrator. Then copy that narrator's tone by writing in his or her voice about things in your own life. Second, watch a few minutes of your favorite film. Note what the camera focuses on and how it focuses on it. And then translate that visual tone into a written narrator by penning a description of the film's opening shots and main characters, the way that the camera sees them. There are thousands of unmade scripts sitting in Hollywood's vaults. And in most cases, what's stopping them from going into production is a problem with the plot. A studio exec read the first few pages and was grabbed by the story world, the characters, and the tone. So the studio pounced and bought the script. But then later they noticed a plot hole, or a glitch in the ending, or another flaw with how the story went. And after a few different writers tried to fix the plot and failed, the script got shipped to the studio's basement, where great story beginnings all go to die. So plotting can be a challenge, even for experienced professionals. And when I talk to first-time screenwriters, their biggest concerns almost always involve plotting. They feel like they've got a handle on their characters and their story world, but they've got too little plot, or too much plot, or the ending feels flat, or they've got a bunch of great scenes but can't connect the dots. But plotting doesn't need to be an exercise in chronic exasperation, because your brain is a master of plotting. It plots each second of your life. Every time you check what the weather's going to be tomorrow, or decide what you're going to eat for lunch, you're plotting. In fact, every time you act, whether you think about it consciously or not, you're plotting. When you hit play to start this lecture, that was a plot choice. Now, sometimes students say to me, maybe other people's brains work like that, but mine doesn't. I'm terrible at choosing what to eat for lunch. And when I check the weather, I'm really just hoping that there isn't rain because I've been too disorganized to buy an umbrella. So really, my life isn't plotted at all. I'm winging it without a plan. Well, if that's how you feel, I'm going to level with you and tell you the hard truth. If your life is in chaos, it's not because you're bad at plotting. It's because you're too good. Your brain is constantly coming up with lots of plots. There's loads of lunches it could imagine eating, lots of great courses it might like to try. So when your life descends into disarray and last-minute panic, the problem is not that you can't plot. The problem is that you can't stop plotting. You see endless possibilities, and you don't have the time to act all of them out yourself. So even if your life seems like a wild explosion of warring storylines, you're a master of crafting narrative. We all are. Humans have become the lords of this planet because we have outplotted every other species on it. So what's the problem? If our brains are naturally good at plotting, why do so many first-time screenwriters get lost or stranded halfway there or swamped with subplots that just won't converge? And why do so many professionals struggle too? The answer is that we make the mistake of trying to plot forward. And when you plot, it's much easier to do it backward. Take perhaps the most intricately plotted form of story, detective fiction. A good mystery has to be crammed with twists and false leads and misdirections, and yet wrap up satisfyingly with a neat whodunit. So how do the writers of detective fiction do it? Well, if you ask any published writer, they'll tell you they plot backward. They start with the final solution to the crime and then build back earlier twists and clues into the plot. The same method works for every kind of story. Once you nail down where you need to go, your brain's natural powers will take over and create a plan to get there. You'll recognize this method as our old friend, reverse engineering. It always comes back to reverse engineering. Always start at the end and build back. That way, you can never get lost, because you've already been there. As we'll see over this lecture, reverse engineering is all you need to plot your next film script. You don't need to worry about a 3-act structure, and you don't need to consult one of those plot diagrams with a triangle-shaped climax or some other geometric shape. The belief that movie scripts should all have 3 acts stems from a misunderstanding of Aristotle's observation that stories all have a 3-part structure: beginning, middle, end. But Aristotle meant that all stories naturally achieve this organic 3-part structure. He didn't mean that the 3 parts needed to be any specific length or fall into any particular number of acts. And those geometric plot maps are too simple and too prescriptive to capture how stories work. Stories have an enormous structural variety and flexibility that reflects their origins as adaptive mental software, which is why modern neuroscience suggests that the real secret to plotting lies within you. in your everyday biology, in your own natural powers of narrative, in the storytelling abilities that you use to schedule your time, to tell anecdotes about your life, and to daydream about your future. To translate these everyday abilities into movie scripts, all you need to do is practice plotting backward. Because when you plot backward, you constrain the possibilities for the story, so that instead of branching out in endless, half-realized pursuits, your brain's natural storytelling powers are focused on a single outcome. This turns plotting into an exercise in problem solving, which is a natural biological recipe for structured creativity, allowing you to invent cleverly original story beats in a systematic way. So you get as firm a guide as a 3-act formula, but without the cookie-cutter results. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll practice this method of reverse engineering plots, starting with some classic examples from Shakespeare, and then moving on to Oscar-winning scripts. And to keep things simple at first, we won't jump right into a full-length plot. We'll start by first reverse engineering a scene. If you can build a scene, you can build a whole plot. Partly, that's because plots are just scenes strung together. But more fundamentally, it's because the method for creating plots and scenes is identical. We start with the ending and work back to the opening conflict that we need to get there. Okay, so what's a scene? How long is it? What does it do? Scenes can vary widely in length. Most of the time in TV and film scripts, scenes are between half a page and 2 pages, which is to say roughly between 30 seconds and a couple minutes. But they can be as short or as long as you need to do the job. That job, and the job of every scene, is to carry the audience to a new cognitive destination, whether happiness or epiphany or suspense or wonder or anything else. So the first step in crafting a scene is to decide on the cognitive effect you want to create in your audience's mind. Then you borrow or adapt or invent a story structure that creates that effect. And finally, you install an opening conflict to drive that story forward. So to sum that up, the 3 steps are cognitive effect, story structure, opening conflict. Or to use Aristotle's terms, end, beginning, middle. So that when you flip things around in your written script going beginning, middle, end, you engage your audience with an opening conflict, carry them through a story structure, and leave them with a new feeling or perspective or other cognitive effect. To see this method in action, let's turn now to a scene from Shakespeare. Although Shakespeare never uses the term reverse engineering, he was trained in this method from childhood because it was a staple of Renaissance and classical manuals on rhetoric. And because Shakespeare wrote everything from farce to high tragedy, existential horror to romantic comedy, he reveals how nuanced and flexible this method of building scenes can be. So let's start by pretending that we're young Shakespeare, and we want to write a play about the villainous Richard III. And early on in our script, we want a scene where our nefarious hero amazes the audience with his devilish powers. And we know that we need to come up with something really devilish to amaze our audience's brains, because they've recently watched Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, where the villainous hero makes a satanic pact to get actual demonic powers. So what would make our villainous hero more amazing than Dr. Faustus? Well, what if our hero did something darkly magical without the aid of dark magic? What if he was so powerful he could cast spells just by using ordinary words without the devil's help? Even Faustus couldn't pull that off. Okay, so what amazing spell could our hero cast? Well, the biggest miracle in the Bible is the resurrection. So what if in our scene, Richard did his own demonic version of a resurrection, turning something dead into something alive? What if he showed up at a funeral and turned it into a wedding? And since our history books tell us that Richard III married Lady Anne, and since they also tell us that Richard murdered a number of Anne's family members, what if we wrote a scene where Richard turned up to a funeral for Anne's murdered relative? And right there, over the casket, he convinced the angry and grieving Anne to marry him and start a new family. That would definitely astonish audiences with Richard's devilish powers of speech. You can already see how our method of reverse engineering is turning plotting into an exercise in asking story questions and then solving them. We ask a question, then we find a story solution, which raises another question, which we then answer with another story solution. This process of narrative problem solving is something your brain has evolved specifically to do. If you stare at a blank page trying to dream up an original plot, your brain will rebel and give you writer's block. But if you give your brain a narrative puzzle to solve, it'll start cranking away. So back to our scene. How could Richard convince the relative of one of his victims to marry him? Well, the most straightforward approach would be to convince her that the killing was done out of love. That way, what seems an act of hate would be transformed into a kind of Valentine. And that's exactly what Shakespeare does in Act 1, Scene 2 of Richard III. When Anne accuses Richard of having killed her family member, Richard insists that it was an act of love. He saw a good man, so he sent him to heaven, where good men belong. Anne is skeptical, but Richard continues to insist that his apparent acts of hate were in fact acts of devotion, swearing that he killed Anne's husband because he loved her, and declaring that he will kill himself if Anne desires it. And slowly, Anne becomes unmoored from her old certainties about Richard. She starts to believe that maybe there can be a kind of love in hate. And if Richard's hate is love, then perhaps her own hate for Richard can be a kind of love as well, allowing for a funeral to become a wedding. Okay, so now that we've reverse engineered our scene's story structure, how do we build back an opening conflict to set this plot in motion? Well, to maximize the demonic magic of Richard's spell, Anne should begin the scene on the side of God and the saints, having no doubt that Richard and his deeds are absolutely evil. Then Richard should flip her moral universe by suggesting that bad things can be good. So the conflict will be between Anne's world of moral certainty and Richard's character of moral inversion. To establish that conflict, we can have Anne utter moral pronouncements that Richard then flips through the dark arts of wordplay. So Anne will snap, "Villain, thou knowest not law of God nor man, no beast so fierce, but knows some touch of pity." To which Richard will punningly respond, "But I know none, and therefore am no beast." Richard's double meanings will muddy Anne's clear divide between right and wrong, suggesting that the two aren't in fact so easy to disentangle. Maybe wrong is right, and down is up, and death is life, allowing Richard to then convince Anne that a funeral can be a wedding. And there you go. You've just created a devilishly amazing scene that puts Christopher Marlowe in your shade and made you into a famous young scriptwriter. And you did it through reverse engineering. We started with our ending, which was a cognitive effect of devilish wonder. Then we reverse engineered our middle, which was a story structure that transformed a holy funeral into a demonic wedding. And then we finished with our beginning, which was a conflict between a story world of moral absolutism and a character of moral ambiguity. And that's how you create all of your scenes. You start with your ending, which is your desired cognitive effect. You move on to your middle, which is your reverse engineered story structure, and you finish with your beginning, which is the opening conflict. When you get into a writing groove, you can often intuit your ending without having to consciously verbalize it. And you can also often draw story structures from your mind's deep memory without consciously recalling what original literary sources they came from. As long as your scenes are working, you can trust these more automated mental processes. But if you run into problems, slow down and make your reverse engineering more deliberate. And even the most cleverly intuited scenes can usually do with tightening. So when you revise, polish by consciously reverse engineering all the beats, ruthlessly cutting any that aren't necessary for your final effect. And if your scene feels like it's lagging, or the action in any part of your story seems slow or drifting, go back a few beats and tighten the conflict. Conflict is what drives plot forward, creating urgency and stakes. So whenever the action starts to feel stale or dull, clarify the conflict and ratchet it up. The trickiest part of the reverse engineering sequence is the middle. That is the part where you settle on the right story structure to generate your desired cognitive effect. You can build these story structures from scratch, but it usually helps to have a rough historical blueprint to work from, like Shakespeare did with the model of the Faustian magic trick. So when you're not writing, always make time to mine your favorite scripts for general story structures that generate cognitive effects you like, creating your own mental library of story structures to tweak, adapt, and refine. And if you ever find yourself stuck at this middle part of the process, here's a rule of thumb that might help. The overarching story structure of most scenes is usually a change in one character's emotions or understanding or perception of the world. So start by identifying the character who needs to change, and then put yourself in that character's place asking, what would alter my mind? One simple plot trick is to give the character an emotionally charged object. For example, in Birdman, where the method actor Mike Shiner is handed a gin bottle full of water. Another simple plot trick is to give the character a new piece of information, like when the customs agent at the end of The Usual Suspects suddenly realizes the identity of Kaiser Sose. And you can also use one of your characters to convert another. This conversion can be achieved simply by lying or by trickery, but as Richard III demonstrates, it's also possible for one character to change another character's deeper worldview or ethical framework, converting them to a new way of being. These deeper character conversions often drive the main turning points of plots. And if you ever run dry on ideas of how to achieve them, you can always use Shakespeare's favorite technique for converting characters, the mirror scene. In a mirror scene, one character serves as another character's mirror, reflecting their behavior back in a way that causes them to criticize themselves and change, like when Laertes serves as a mirror for Hamlet, or Beatrice serves as a mirror for Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. This mirror technique is flexible enough to be used in almost any situation, no matter how far removed from Shakespearean England you might be. In Spike Jonze's futuristic script for Her, Theodore Twombly falls in love with his computer operating system, and then meets Amy, who mirrors back Theodore's situation by revealing that she's romantically involved with her computer, too. So now that we've got some practice reverse engineering a scene, let's take the next step and see how the same method can be used to build a full-length plot. For your first full screenplay plot, the best way to learn is to adapt a story from a novel, or a short story, or a comic book, or a memoir, or some other pre-existing narrative that you love and no other screenwriter has adapted yet. That way you're starting with a proven plot structure, and you can learn from the story choices that the original author made. This can seem derivative, but Shakespeare adapted almost all of his scripts, and every year the Academy gives out an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. There's really no shame in writing the next Hamlet or Casablanca. And even though this method allows you to harness the strengths of a pre-existing plot, it still gives you two major opportunities to be original. First, out of all the millions of unadapted stories out there, you choose the one that fits with your vision. And second, you cut and shape and elaborate your source material to bring out the specific story that you see in it. Because good source material can be adapted in endless ways to emphasize different effects. That's why every generation comes up with new ways to adapt Shakespeare. So when you adapt, you don't just blindly copy a plot you like. You use reverse engineering to select a specific plot that has untapped script potential, and then you use the same reverse engineering method to refine and tailor the plot to achieve your intended effect. As an example of how this works, here's how Shakespeare did it in one of his most tightly plotted plays, Othello. As Shakespeare was entering the prime of his career, he decided that he wanted to write a script that created the feeling of ironic horror that he admired in classical tragedy. But Shakespeare didn't want to repeat the old story of a hero who is destroyed by a greater cycle of fate or history. Instead, he wanted to tell a new kind of tragic story that emphasized the destructive powers of the human doubts that lie inside all of our minds. And that led Shakespeare to see the tragic potential of a 40-year-old Italian short story about a Moor named Othello who had murdered his wife after being tricked into thinking that she was unfaithful. Other dramatists hadn't seen anything special here. But what struck Shakespeare about the story was that the Moor wasn't tricked by a simple sleight of hand. No, Othello only believed that his wife had been unfaithful after his own self-esteem had been eroded first. As a black man in a white-skinned land, the Moor was constantly made to feel an outsider. Everywhere he went, everyone stared and whispered. until he became profoundly insecure, coming to doubt his own self-worth so severely that he no longer believed that a good woman would ever love him. So in this old story, Shakespeare saw a chance to write a new kind of script about how our insecurities become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Othello's destruction showed that even without the oracles of the ancient stage, we can become the victims of a darkly ironic tragedy. And after Shakespeare saw the potential in this plotline that his contemporaries had overlooked, he then continued to display his originality by elaborating and strengthening his source material as he adapted it. For example, the crucial story beat where Othello comes to doubt himself is accomplished quickly and crudely in the original short story. But to Shakespeare, this was the heart of the story. This was the moment where a good man was ruined by his own doubts, twisted to destroy the woman he most loved. And to dramatize this conversion and make it compelling, Shakespeare used his favorite device of a mirror scene, crafting a scene where Othello's false friend Iago reflects Othello's deepest insecurities back, asking him, "Haven't you seen how people shake at your looks? So what kind of a woman would marry a man who looks like you? She'd have to have a will most rank, filled with foul disproportion and thoughts unnatural." With this scene, Shakespeare clarified what he saw as special about the plot he adapted. And you can do the same thing if you use reverse engineering to adapt a pre-existing story for your next screenplay. Because by identifying the specific parts of that story that generate the cognitive effect you want your audience to experience, you can cut away the parts that don't matter and shape and expand the crucial story beats with new dialogue and plot. So if you use reverse engineering, every script you adapt will be a deeply original work, because the deep choices you'll be making will be conscious and independent. Even when you stick exactly with your original, you'll be doing it intentionally. And if the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay isn't enough, and you want to take a shot at Best Original, the method remains the same. You start by identifying the cognitive effect that you want to create in your audience's mind, then you adapt a pre-existing plot structure to make it happen, and finally, you lay in the opening conflict between story world and character to drive the plot forward. To see how this works, let's wrap our lecture by reverse engineering the script that's widely revered as the most smartly plotted original screenplay in Hollywood history. I'm speaking, of course, of Chinatown. If you haven't had a chance to watch Chinatown or read the script, I'd recommend doing so now. It's a cracker, and I'm about to give away the ending. Okay, so if you're still with me, Chinatown was inspired by the author's conversation with an old cop who said the criminal enterprises in Chinatown were so murkily intricate that even the best cops got scrambled. They thought they were busting crime, but in reality, they were perpetuating it. The screenwriter wanted to make his audience experience this tragic sense of confusion, of thinking that you're doing good while really making things worse. So to reverse engineer this cognitive effect, the screenwriter plotted a story about a murder in Chinatown that seems to be one crime, but is really another. So that, like the cops of Chinatown, we in the audience believe that we're unraveling one misdeed, but really, we're participating in a worse one. Specifically, when we first read or watch Chinatown, we think it's a pulp fiction noir about a shadowy mogul who cooks up a giant real estate scheme with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. But really, Chinatown is a family drama inspired by Greek tragedies like Oedipus. Because the real story of Chinatown is that the mogul lost his mind years ago after his wife died, forcing his daughter to be his new wife and getting her pregnant with her own sister. Since that's a lot of plot detail, let's hit pause for a second and refresh what we've learned so far. The screenwriter's first step was to select the cognitive effect of his ending, which was to make his audience feel the tragic experience of being a cop in Chinatown. And to create that tragic experience of blindly confusing two crimes, the screenwriter's next step was to reverse engineer the two crimes, which he did by borrowing a pair of classic story structures, a conspiracy noir plot and a Greek tragedy. So the writer's innovation wasn't either of those structures. His innovation was to combine them. From here, the screenwriter then moved on to his third step, which was to confound these two stories in his audience's mind. To do this, the screenwriter reverse engineered a plot link between the conspiracy noir and the Greek tragedy. Specifically, the link was to make the mogul's son-in-law a participant in the crooked water scheme. So the same man who was at the center of the vast real estate conspiracy also knew the mogul's dark family secret. And this plot link is, more than anything, the crucial reverse engineer, because it makes the audience mix up a Greek tragedy with a pulp noir. The screenwriter's next story puzzle was how to reveal the son-in-law's dual role to the audience. And since the deep story of Chinatown is a Greek tragedy, the screenwriter solved this puzzle by turning to Oedipus and borrowing its famous plot device of the moment of recognition, or anagnorisis, which we discussed in our opening lecture. In this ancient story structure, a person's mistaken identity is introduced at the start of the script, and his true identity is only revealed at the tragic conclusion. So in keeping with this structure, Chinatown withholds the knowledge of the son-in-law's dual role until the very last beats, and the script introduces the son-in-law's mistaken identity at the very beginning by feigning that he was murdered to conceal the real estate plot. This makes the audience feel like they're heroically unraveling a labyrinth of civic fraud, when really they're being made into stooges who help the shadowy mogul get rid of his son-in-law, cover up his dark family secret, and retrieve his incestuously conceived granddaughter. Echoing the structure of Oedipus, where the title character thinks that he's heroically unraveling the mystery of the plague, but is really discovering his participation in an incestuous crime. All of Chinatown's other story beats are reverse engineered from here. And even though we don't have time to touch on every one, let's do the two most important moments, the beginning and the final scene. Since Chinatown is a tragedy, and since the big rule of tragedy is the return of the past, the cognitive effect of every tragedy's beginning is always the same as the end. That cognitive effect is just less intense at the beginning because there's no irony to deepen it yet. So since the ultimate cognitive effect of Chinatown is a feeling of solving one crime when we're really participating in a worse one, how would the script's beginning create this cognitive effect in miniature? Well, it would open with a detective who tries to solve a crime but ends up facilitating a worse one, which is exactly what happens at the beginning of Chinatown. A private investigator is contacted by a woman who claims that she wants to catch her husband cheating. But a few beats later, when the investigator tracks down the supposedly cheating husband, he gets the husband killed. So you see, the opening of Chinatown's script is reverse engineered to create the cognitive effect of realizing that we got pulled into a terrible crime when we thought we were unraveling another one, making it tragically ironic that we fall into the exact same too-late epiphany again in the end. And the beginning of the script establishes the world character conflict to get both of these too-late epiphanies underway by introducing a detective who tells clients the hard facts about their cheating spouses, and then having this detective meet a lying client who embodies the story world's duplicity, putting a truth-seeking, tragic hero in conflict with a story world of doubleness that eventually defeats him. Finally, there's the script's last scene, which was famously changed by the director Roman Polanski. In the original ending, the mogul died. But Polanski realized that the whole point of the story was to have the apparently heroic solving of one crime lead to the tragic success of a worse crime. And so in the revised ending, the mogul gets away with his arm around his granddaughter, who he wants to love just like he loved her mother. It's the clear story choice if you reverse engineer. So the big lesson here is that if you want to create a script as complex and multi-stranded as Chinatown, you can do it through reverse engineering. The writer of Chinatown started with a clear cognitive goal in mind and then plotted out his double story structure in reverse. And once he found his way back to the beginning, he drove the action ahead by establishing a strong conflict between character and story world. So when you want to drive your plot forward, reverse engineer conflict. And when you don't know yet what forward route your plot should take, jump to the end and reverse engineer your path back. In this lecture, to keep things simple, we focused on tragic plot structures. But in our later lectures on film scripts, from Casablanca to Fargo, we'll discover critically and commercially successful plots from all sorts of genres that were created by the same exact process of reverse engineering. And we'll see that they have 4 acts, or 5 acts, or out-of-order acts, or even a whole first act where we don't meet the main character at all. Because the way that writers developed all these uniquely compelling plots was by problem solving backward from the cognitive effect they wanted to create, freeing their brains to carry us all on a journey we've never taken before. If you'd like to get started on reverse engineering your own unique plot, here's 2 exercises you can try. First, find a neglected novel, or short story, or fairy tale, or any other narrative to adapt. Identify the feeling or mood or other cognitive effect that the original source material creates in you. Then go back and circle the moments in the plot that most generate this cognitive effect. Now turn one of these moments into your own dramatic scene, drawing out and emphasizing the story structure that creates the cognitive effect you like. Second, identify the conflict between character and story world that drives your new dramatic scene forward. Now flip back to write the opening 2 scenes of your whole screenplay, establishing the story world with minor characters in the first scene and establishing the character in the second scene. Now you've got the beginning conflict of your script, a key middle scene, and the final cognitive effect you want to create. Beginning, middle, end. And you can reverse engineer all the remaining parts from here.